You're watching Medfield TV, community shows.
Ready. Welcome everyone to the Board of Selectmen meeting for Tuesday, July 10th, 2018. As always, this meeting is being video recorded. We will start with a moment of appreciation for our troops serving in the Middle East and around the world. Thank you. First appointment, Jean Minio has a request for us to sign letters of support for 2 cultural grants.
I don't actually have anything new to present since the last time. Unless you have questions, I'm happy to answer.
So I did have a comment on both of the letters.
Okay.
Which was, just given the uncertainty around what's happening there, I wanted to have less detail in there about the actual plan for the redevelopment of the site, because, I mean,
Okay.
your project could be a part of this no matter what ends up happening.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, my preference would be to take out the references to the redevelopment plan and just say that the cultural uses would be a catalyst for whatever development occurs at
Okay.
the hospital.
I
something
think
like
that's
that.
fine. It was
I
just,
just wouldn't want to get the grant, have them come back to us and say you've done something different than you said in your letter, and have that be a problem.
yeah, it's not, well, the letters aren't about the full development. It's for the specific cultural, initiative, whether it's the feasibility study or the design documents. That's the part that we'll be obligated to complete.
Right.
And the rest of it was just to provide context for where it sits within the master plan, but if you want to make that more general, that's fine. I don't have a problem.
That was my
with
only comment. I don't know what Pete and Gus think. It's a collective letter, so I don't know. Okay. Are you okay with that change?
Yeah.
Do you have a problem with
That's
that
fine,
change?
sure.
Okay. So, we can fix this and get this signed.
Okay.
Otherwise, do you have any objections to the letter?
Nope.
Signing the letter? Pete?
No.
Do we need a motion to sign the letter of support?
You're the only one signing this
Yep.
one, right? Okay. I move that we authorize Selectman Marcucci to sign the letter of support for the next phase of the Cultural
Thank you.
and Arts Center.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
And we'll get edited and I'll sign it.
Okay.
Okay. Since it's not 7:15 yet, and the MSH issue is on for 7:15, we can't start until 7:15, so let's rip through
Mike, there
some-
was another item
Oh.
on a contract, if you want, while I'm up here.
Sorry?
If you have questions, I'll answer
Oh.
that too.
Is the proposal for the architectural existing conditions survey.
Which one is this?
It was in your packet. I can't think of the name of the company off the top of my head.
It's existing condition surveys or something.
Okay.
It's $5,900.
I didn't have any questions on it.
Nope. Although
Great.
he doesn't have his price in his bid, but I,
It was $5,900, it's in there. Yeah,
You're just looking for the selectmen to sign off on it.
yep.
And who has to sign it? Okay.
I move that Selectman Marcucci sign the contract for $5,900 that, in support of the Cultural and Arts Center.
second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Problem.
Oh, geez, right there, directly underneath that. Okay. So action items, we have, we have to sign, we awarded this already, correct?
So there's 2 things tonight. You're going to award the DPW supplies contract,
Okay.
and then I'm looking for a vote from the selectmen to authorize Mo Goulet to sign the contracts as they come in after you've signed the awards.
For each of these things, so we don't have to then,
There's multiple things, and we're holding up the Sursage people based on our meeting timeline versus theirs. So if we can authorize Mo to sign the contracts once you've made the award, I think it'll make things much more efficient for them.
So that's 2 motions. One is first to approve the award of the contract, and second, okay, so first I move that we vote to approve the award of the DPW contract submitted by Mo.
Second?
all in favor?
Aye. Second, I move that we authorize Mo to sign the contracts as they come in now that we've approved the overall contract.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We don't wanna have to go through and sign all 15 of these as they come in for. So for those of you watching at home or here, this is the purchasing collective that we're a part of with a bunch of other towns to buy DPW supplies. And so we have the low bidders that have come in on a variety of supplies, including stone dust, washed sand for snow and ice removal, catch basin frames, gas, diesel, all that sort of stuff. So that's what that is all about. We have a request to vote to sign the Phillip Street Bridge reimbursement request to the state. Anybody have any questions about that?
I move that we vote to sign the request for reimbursement for the Phillips Street Bridge repair from the state.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We've got a request from Marty Murphy to sign the regulatory agreement for the local initiative project at 71 North Street, which you can all see is underway already. So Mr. Burley wasting no time.
And this, he does have comments that he included from both town council and DHCD.
Okay. Any questions on this one?
No.
Pete, any questions, any issues? All right. Do we have a motion?
I move that we sign the regulatory agreement for a local initiative project at 71 North Street.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Is this one for me to sign, or Michael, or who's signing this one?
I believe you assigned as chairman.
And then we have request from Sarah Reposa to sign the A&R plan for the Hinckley property.
The town is the applicant for the property, so it requires both Mike Sullivan's signature and the chairman of the board of selectmen.
Okay. And this is the plan that has been developed by our,
The plan of the application,
This is the application.
right.
so Mark, you just want to walk us through what comes next from the town's perspective on this?
So I've seen the draft of the plan. I think it's being finalized. It was tweaked when it came back. It's creating a new lot, largely made up of a portion of Hinckley, a little bit of the current COA property, and that creates a new lot. And then there's another lot, basically shown as well. And this lot has no frontage or access. It would be required from Lot 3. So you'd have to give, the way it's drawn now, I don't know if that's the way you want to have it, but at the present time, it's a landlocked parcel, and you'd have to grant at least an access easement over Lot 3 to provide access if you were going to develop it. But at any rate, once everybody agrees with what that plan should look like, then it gets endorsed by the planning board, recorded at the registry, and it then effectively, you now have on record this new lot, and you can go about disposing of it however you wish, as well as the other lot, which has the access out to
Harding Street.
Harding
So
Street.
it's not landlocked.
That one's not, but this new, the major parcel that is the focus potentially of senior housing is landlocked.
So just when everybody thought this was going to be a boring meeting, I finally got something with questions. So first off, the title of this is the application for endorsement of plan believed not to require approval.
Right.
What does that mean?
It means it doesn't show as subdivision, because there's exceptions to the subdivision control law. If a plan is showing lots all with frontage, or lots that are designated as non-buildable, then it's not treated as a subdivision, and all the planning board is doing is saying, we looked at this,
Okay.
it's not within our jurisdiction, you're good to go. And that's a requirement in order to put that plan on record at the registry.
So first, that wasn't just a typo, then that really is what it said, but that's what it meant. Okay, next, when I look at item 2, it says this plan creates unbuildable parcels A and B for possible disposition by the town. The plan also modifies the lot line between the center and parcel A. Parcel A and B do not have the required frontage to be considered buildable lots.
Right.
So parcel A is the land from the Hinckley property that we want to use for the Hinckley, the construction of the senior housing on the Hinckley property with a certain amount of land from the COA lot appended to it. And that would then, we'd then have to, I guess, approve access to Ice House Road for that lot, because it's landlocked.
Yeah, I
Is
mean,
that-
for purposes, you have options. This is just for title reasons, that it designate non-buildable because it doesn't have frontage right now. That, I mean, you could, if you're gonna do a 40B, then that is gonna moot it out anyway. If you're gonna grant, you know, that's just for later on. This is just so that it passes muster and can get on record at the registry to create the new lots.
Okay, help me understand what parcel B is.
I'm going off memory, but I think it's a remainder of the Hinckley parcel going out
Right.
to,
Which is,
Harding.
and the reason I care is because if we have access to Harding Street, which when the land was sold or given to the town, that access was deliberately created so that that somebody could build on that lot. We're now calling it an unbuildable lot.
because having access and having legal requisite minimum frontage are not necessarily the same thing. There is access out to Harding Street. I don't know if it actually complies with the zoning requirements or not. My recollection is it doesn't.
By itself, it does not, but,
Right.
well, I don't know either, but by itself, I think it's a 20 or 25-foot frontage on the property
There's
itself.
no way it does. It just provides practical
But there's a
access.
16-foot easement on the adjacent property.
Right.
Why would we have done a 25-foot, 41-foot
Because under the
frontage?
subdivision, under the planning board rules and regs, at that time, that was the minimum width or maximum width for a roadway. So that would have, if you're gonna put a roadway in and subdivide it, as was thought was a potential at one time under traditional subdivision,
Yeah.
that would have given you enough width to do that road in.
What about a driveway? Well,
Because I think as part of this here, I don't know if this is where your question is going, when we originally talked about this plan,
Right.
we were gonna get two things out of this division. You were gonna get the parcel for the senior housing.
Right.
And you were gonna get a single-family lot that the town conceivably could sell, right?
That's my point.
That was
is
kind of where we
we've
thought.
got
Well,
Uh,
there's
this-
no
the-
way you were gonna get, given that lot's delineation, and as of right, I mean, there's access to Harding Street, but you'd have to get a variance, or you'd have to do something creative. You'd only have an as of right, because you don't have enough frontage on Harding Street.
I want to understand the history on this, because that was set up that way specifically when the land was given to the town, as I understood it from Mike, to enable people to be able to build there. The only reason I care, and I don't want to build anything there right now, but we have something between $250,000 and a $500,000 piece of property that the town owns, should it choose to develop it, should it choose to sell it, as long as it's a buildable lot. If this, in fact, has this frontage with an easement that gets a total of 41 feet, and I've been asking this question for the last year, because initially it was all urban wild, and I said, why would we lock up a housing lot? Now suddenly, if it's, I'm not I'll trust your legal judgment here, but I want to understand the history, because when this land came into the town's possession, my understanding, based on what I heard from Mike, is this frontage was there, and that easement was established in order to provide access to that lot.
Assuming at that time there was a potential for a subdivision, and that would be a subdivision road coming in off of Harding Street, and that's wide enough for that purpose. When you create a subdivision, the roadways in the subdivision give you new frontage for lots.
So I would like
Without that roadway, you're relied on what you have now, which is just a limited amount of frontage on Harding Street. You would require either some kind of 40B
or variance.
or variance in order to be able to build on that lot.
I'd like to hear Mike's side of this before, and my whole interest is that I don't want to have us lock up a piece of developable property that the town owns, that the town could potentially sell.
Well, I don't think what you're doing, cutting off the interior portion, is having any effect on this. I don't think it's derogating from that at all. I would-
At this point, only because I've asked the question before about this, and this is the first time I've heard this piece of it, I would kind of like to loop back with Mike and make sure I understand the history on that.
He'll be,
We bought that. It was not a gift. We paid money.
However, like I said, I've talked to Mike once on this, and my understanding was it was to enable access to a rear lot, and so it's just a
Right,
different
no,
story.
as defined as
So-
being able to put a roadway through,
So,
if we
okay.
needed to.
I just want to
So we're
make
just
sure I
coming at
understand it.
development from the other side, so it's kind of turned things around.
I
A question?
I'm gonna recuse
Oh.
myself from this whole thing because I live next door to it.
Yeah, I agree with Gus. I mean, I had thought in this subdivision that was gonna be drawn out for that option in the future, so we wouldn't have to do it again if we chose to sell that piece of property in the future. So I'd like the answers to the same questions. So, and maybe it's Sarah or maybe it's Mike. or-
Mike, maybe, he's just at the Water and Sewer Board meeting. He'll be returning so that we can talk to him about
We'll
that.
put
Do we
that.
have, do you have copies of the plan, reduced copies or something?
I think, yeah, that was,
This
that,
is what
yeah,
was
I got it.
sent to us
Yep.
here, okay. All right, we voted to sign the LIP project, we've gotta wait for this one. I think on the dangerous dog hearing scheduled for July 31st, 2018, Mark, you've been in touch with them.
Yes, I'm asking that you take no action as of tonight on the request to reschedule, and I'll update you at the next meeting. There's a potential that the thing could be resolved completely.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. We'll defer the discussion of the water ban until after when the Water and Sewer Board is up here. So we've passed 7:15, and so we're on to our discussion of the Medfield State Hospital master plan. Steve, do you want to give us just a short 2 minutes on where you think you are in the process? I know we have, I know the Board of Selectmen and others have received a draft of it, and I'm sure we've made our way through it partially or completely, but just a status report kind of on where you see the current status of the draft master plan.
Sure. So, we circulated two things. Last week, we circulated the actual draft of the master plan, and then, I guess Monday, just yesterday, I circulated the appendices. So there are two separate documents, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So we now have gotten from our consultant drafts of the full master plan and the appendices, which is the first time we've had them all as a single document. So right now, we're soliciting feedback, including from you, and we've gotten some feedback already from the warrant committee. And we ourselves are reviewing this. This is a turn in response to our individual comments, basically, that were all submitted. So we're now next going to meet as a group after having reviewed this version and come up with a group markup effectively, which hopefully will incorporate other feedback we get from other groups, other committees, and our own feedback. We'll give a comprehensive markup back to our consultants with the hope that we'll have a revised, hopefully final draft by the end of this month. So that's our target. Sarah had actually given us a schedule which kind of laid out what it would take to adopt the zoning, which is one of the appendices in the plan, by late October, which would include starting hearings sometime in late August with the statutory planning board hearings. And the committee feels that a certain amount of outreach to the public after having years of input to give them the end result would be helpful. So we've tentatively scheduled a date in September 20, to actually make a public presentation of the plan. So that's kind of the big picture of where we are. But we're pretty much out of money with our consultants, so we're down to the point of giving a final round of feedback and hopefully getting what we believe is a final draft this month.
Okay. Before we get into kind of our side of the agenda, do you have anything in particular you'd like to accomplish tonight?
It's really mostly, a listening event for us. I mean, we had a more formal presentation last meeting, which was a couple weeks ago, which unfortunately we didn't have the plan, and we had hoped to have the plan. So we've sort of gotten the order backwards, that we've made our presentation before we gave you the plan. But this is the written plan, which I think it has all the elements that we talked about at our meeting. We also have now the zoning, which I described at the earlier meeting, but you can actually see it concretely now and see how the different uses line up and how they're permitted or not permitted in particular sub-districts at the hospital property. So that to me is an important document that goes with the plan, because the zoning is what basically would enable the redevelopment to proceed. So we basically went through the mix of uses around the property. So if you want a recap of that, I'm happy to give it, but you've sort of heard it already. But
I don't know, Peter, Gus, do either of you want a recap of that?
I have both some general questions that are probably appropriate to share, or general comments that are appropriate to share in the meeting. And I have a whole slew of specific questions and comments that are not critical, they're just trying to understand things. So it's got more to do with me either not being sure what something, what a specific thing, and the question I'd have around that is, at some point I should sit down with someone who's prepared to give me, I'll guess, an hour and a half to go through page by page on the things that I had. But it's not a set of attacking questions. It's just editorial or things.
Yep.
So just so you know, just because I've got having just gone through with Jean a red pen markup on her Culture and Arts Center, I don't want people, just because I use red pen, it doesn't mean anything other than it's easier for me to spot.
Right.
So I had a few general comments. The one probably specific informational thing that I snagged on a little bit had to do with the Monte Carlo simulation of for the commercial developer side of things. And Pat, you're here, you may speak to it, but the idea that it's 50-50, good news, bad news, doesn't feel to me like that's a plan that's presenting something to developers that they're gonna be attracted to. Because that's a coin flip on whether I think it's a coin flip on whether you make money, or if you don't, you come back to the town for higher density. So I could be wrong about all that, but that's the one piece of this three-part justification that still feels pretty weak to me, because it seems like it's a coin flip, and that's probably not good enough.
Do you want to pause on that, or do you?
No, I'd be happy to.
We're at a point where, unfortunately, the last piece to fall into place is going to be the source materials, including the source financial model, which we've been bugging our consultant to get, but we don't have yet. She says she's making some final tweaks, but we hope to have it pretty soon. But Pat has done about as much as anybody on trying to get under the hood in an earlier iteration of it and doing the Monte Carlo analysis. So I don't know if you want to say anything or make any remarks about it.
If you do want to say anything, I just ask that you use the microphone so that our many viewers back at home can hear you.
Yeah, so the Monte Carlo does indeed show sort of a 50-50 outcome. The challenge we have is if we, knowing what we know now, came up with a plan where we'd be highly certain that a developer would be happy, we'd be running the risk of making the developer very happy, if you know what I mean, in the sense that we would be giving them, density that would be attractive for them, but maybe less attractive for the town. Mm-hmm. Where if we went out for a competitive bid, we might find that, people can work within the plan that we have now. So I think the way to address it is not so much to come up with something that's like a 95% probability of being attractive given what we know now, but rather through the disposition process to, in our RFP, favor people that come in with a lower density. Mm-hmm. And if they have to push back, they'll push back. And then we'll know what the resistance point is, rather than setting a high bar for density that may be higher than is necessary for us at this point.
So I should look at that as, this is putting it right on the knife edge for the developer, but that's actually where we want to be. Is that
right?
fair?
You kind of, yeah, and then we can,
okay.
We can structure things so that, if we're wrong, and things are really come out on the south side of that distribution, people will, we should structure it so they can push back. But we may get, go out on that knife edge and find people that can work within the, the plan that we have and, go from there.
So I'm out of my element in real estate development of this scale. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm only going by gut instinct or maybe common sense or what I think is passive or common sense. The one concern I had about that was whether we would have developers that would look at that as being such a marginally structured opportunity that they would choose not to bid.
Mm-hmm.
So that was when I first saw it that way. It's like, how many developers that we might otherwise want to hear from will we scare off by making this so close to the edge that they're saying it's a crapshoot whether this would be good for us or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a comment. I don't know what I'm talking about that, but that's how I reacted.
No, and I would expect that as we go down the, the road, that, so first off, we're going to be getting the detailed plan from McCabe, and Associates following, the contract says we get it at the end. So then we'll have that in detail. And I'm coming into this expecting that we would maybe have some working sessions, perhaps in executive session, because we don't want to kind of, tip our, the resistance point in a negotiation, but kind of work through, where we think the right, point is, where we're, stressing people a little bit, but not scaring them away,
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I should have started with a different comment, because most, if not all, of the master planning committee members seem to be here in the room. I hope you've heard me before acknowledge the time and effort you all put in, and the respect and appreciation I have for that. I can tell you, quite aside from all the nitpicky things that I'm going to sit down with somebody on, I was very impressed with what you have here. And the thing that impressed me is, in some ways, I guess, having gone to a lot of your meetings, there was a more coherent message in this book than I sometimes picked up in individual meetings. But the thing that came through for me very clearly is that there's a very careful, sensitive, thoughtful approach that you've all taken to try to understand what people were looking for, to try maybe even to go beyond what people may have told you, to understand what Medfield is and what some of the traditions that are important to Medfield are. And I found that more articulately expressed in this book than I sometimes have in some of the meetings. So before I start sitting there pulling on threads, that's a pretty important thing you all should know, is all that time and effort really, I see it in here, and I was grateful for the effort that you put into it. So I should have started with that before I start going after stuff.
Better late than never.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I have more. I have more here.
With that out of the way, all right, here's the rest of it.
I wanted to make some, and the broad comments I want to make have to do with stepping all the way back, trying to look at this strategically in the big picture sense, so it's not automatically going down into the details. One of the things that I've acknowledged that I think we'll at least start talking about later tonight is this seems to be an open issue around the water and sewer capacity in terms of getting in sync with DPW, and in terms of making sure that the cost factors that we're taking into account here around the infrastructure on the site, somewhere in this mix, if there are cost factors for the broader town infrastructure getting to the site, which some of the emails that got passed in the last week suggested there were, that we've got our arms around that. That's not necessarily, it's not on the site books, but it's it sounds like it might be an implication for the town, so I'm just acknowledging it feels like that's an unanswered, unresolved issue.
I was surprised by some of the back and forth, because our consultants had met with water and sewer, and maybe there was a disconnect in that communication, but we had thought that was a pretty comprehensive number, but it's possible it wasn't, so.
Yeah, I'm not throwing that all at you either. It's just that it sounds like that's an open thread. Maybe the third broad comment I'll make is that the proposition for the town is a proposition that sounds to me like we're gonna have to figure out how to deal with, I think something like $28 million in costs that right now doesn't appear to be the kind of cost that can be folded into some developer to pick up. What that led me to start to ask, and as I reviewed the plan, I started looking for evidence that the committee had considered what I'll call crass, mercenary, high-value real estate development in selective places where the economics would be different for the town, because, and I'll give you an example. If you look at the land that's to the as you're entering the property at the security trailer, the land up on the bluff right there, that's not really in front of the campus, but there's probably two buildable could be luxury lots that could go there, and I'm sitting there saying it's not really in a view shed. It shows up on the map like a view shed, but it's not really I'm not arguing for that in particular, but I'm raising what potentially are distasteful ideas around just crassly looking for ways to cash in on some of the property that we have in order to actually change the financial picture for the town. So I'm not trying to get an answer tonight. I'm just saying, as I reviewed this, I was looking for these alternatives that said, well, we looked at possibly doing this. If we did this, it would mean this much more that would come in. And I'm still struggling a little bit with how this is all gonna work when we go to the town and ask for approval and throw some number like $28 million out on top of a new school, on top of potentially a new park and rec center. So,
I mean, just a quick reaction to that. So working with the warrant.
Do you have your microphone there, Pat?
I do.
There we go. You're hiding it behind your, yeah, just want to make sure.
So, working with, primarily with Jack and Martha, we've gone over a number of scenarios. One of which is, what happens if we just take everything down and raise it? But another one was, what if we add some of these high-value units, and what can that do to offset some of these infrastructure costs? So. In the plan, there's a high-end residential multifamily units called 10B, and that lent itself to analysis because we could just look at the financials and say, okay, if we just replicate these things, what can we do to improve the developer's margin? And it's on the order of, for every 3 additional buildings of that nature, you can create another $5 million worth of gross profit for a developer, so you can just scale that up. So if we were trying to offset like all of the demo costs and all of the infrastructure costs, as an example, just starting over with that type of building, we've got an analysis here I can share in some detail, maybe at some other time, but if you replicated that building 26 times for a total of 312 units, you could offset all of our costs, right? So we have that kind of analysis. And then you can do a marginal analysis on if you need an extra, 15 million, you'd have another 10 units of those buildings, so.
So again, I'm not trying to hash it out tonight, but what I'm getting at is at some point, we're gonna go to the town and look for approval of zoning that's backed by a master plan.
Right.
And that master plan is gonna have a price tag for the town associated with it. And I would hate for the total master plan to go down, or the total zoning to go down, because the town doesn't like the master plan because they don't like their price tag. And if there was a way for, stepping back, this is probably as close to prime real estate in Medfield as you can get. So if we were just in a vacuum, we'd sit there and say, this is where you put the high-value housing and you put the more utilitarian stuff somewhere else. We're not doing that. But if there are ways that we could do some of that that could have an impact on the price tag for the town.
Right.
I'm looking ahead to a vote and saying, how do you improve the odds that you present something that people like this?
Yeah.
Pat, I'm kind of curious if you have worked out the tax revenue to the town of those buildings as well? Because I guess what I'm looking at primarily is the long run for the town. How much are we going to be profiting by our tax revenue over our costs in the out years? So if we had one of those 10B buildings, how much do we get in more tax revenue?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is, at the moment, the McCabe's financial model is a little bit of a black box to us, but I'm imagining within a matter of a week or two here, we'll have it and be able to do that. So then we can look at the marginal tax revenue, but also, impact of kids on schools and stuff like that. So, yeah, so this was what I was alluding to as sort of a quick and dirty sensitivity analysis. Main message being, there's a trade-off between our finances and density, and we can look at, moving the dial incrementally to, to look at that trade-off.
Put another way, if there's a trade-off between density and the economics, I would rather see us trade off a smaller number of high-value houses to a larger number of low-value houses, is another way of putting that.
Yeah. I guess the one refinement is that at least the model we have from a town perspective is actually positive. It's the developers' numbers that are at the, teeter-totter. But that, we had a chapter in here exploring some of the development options, including, tax increment financing or other ways to monetize the future tax revenues without having to come out of pocket with a check for $25 million or whatever it is. So that's one of the techniques to utilize that increased tax revenues that would come from development to actually pay for the infrastructure on the back of the development itself rather than on town revenues.
It wouldn't break my heart if we had a way to actually have the town not, if we can save the town money, whether it's a smaller outlay that
Right.
eventually gets paid back, or whether it's actually a return on our investment.
Right.
I wouldn't mind. My personal experience in wrong-headed thinking around this is when I worked in New London, Connecticut. If you ever go to New London, Connecticut, and you get off of Route 95, you come off Route 95, it's right on the Thames River, you head into New London, and right up on the right-hand side, as you're headed into New London, is a very large, low-income housing project overlooking the Thames River. At the time, it was done in the 60s, everybody thought, well, everybody should have river views, even people who are poor, so they basically put low-income housing in one of the prime locations that would have been high value, created a city that the very first thing you see when you walk in is a housing project followed by the police station. And I'm convinced that that's part of why New London has been a struggling city. Geographically, it's the equivalent of Newport, Rhode Island. History, it's the equivalent. Everything is the equivalent, except New London is a fairly down-on-the-heels city, and it's always been that. And part of that, I think, was because they misused some of their highest value property for purposes that, didn't give them the full economic risk. So I'm a little sensitive to that.
Well, we in fact were conscious of that and tried to reserve a lot of the areas out by where the water views and the views to the north are high-value housing, and the new buildings that are overlooking the Charles are high-value housing. So, we tried to be conscious of that and not squander our views on low-return things.
My question wasn't, let's put a luxury gated community in there. It's just that if these numbers are tentative, have we actually looked at doing, more of that, I guess? And it's a question, it's not a position.
Well, and I think that one of the issues and one of the challenges is going to be how you structure a disposition approach to try to bring out proposals that may actually, result in that. I think one of the trade-offs you have to be careful of is the school children factor, and we put in a lot of senior housing on the idea that helps keep down the number of school children, which does cost a lot to the town. So if you throw it wide open and somebody says, yeah, I can come in and do a bunch of large, multi-bedroom, high-value stuff, you may end up with a lot more school children than we've predicted in the plan. So there's a trade-off on that side, too.
So I'm going to publicly become the outlier on this whole view on schools for two reasons. Number one, the state projections on where suburban populations are headed is in the direction of older and older populations. So if we accept the state's projections, that says the natural trend here is toward towns like ours becoming older and older and having fewer and fewer children. Secondly, since FY10, we're down almost 400 students from where we were back in FY10. So the idea that any students coming in here is a disaster, we have a fair buffer before we even approach the capacity that we were at 9 years ago. So I personally, and I was on board with this, let's keep seniors, we need to address senior needs, so that's a different issue. But the idea that we need to do extraordinary things to make sure that we don't have families with children show up, I actually think is a mistake for us as a town, because at some point 20 years down the road, this becomes a very old town with very old people. And I don't think that would be a good thing for Medfield. I think
I think the case has been made that even declining levels, you can't offer as many APs or as many special activities. So this isn't a zero-child project in any sense, but we were trying to be mindful of that buffer as you describe it and not blow past it. So.
I'm not looking to blow past it.
So I guess I would just comment, Gus, that, there was a time, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when Medfield had the highest % of its population in the school system of any town, city or town in the state. I've always thought that we are doing our fair share for educating the children of the Commonwealth, probably more so than most other cities and towns in the state. And that is part of the reason that our taxes are so high in this town. So I don't necessarily feel an obligation to build a town-sponsored project for children that are gonna come in from outside of town. I wanna design the project, I guess, so it's as economic as it can be for the town's standpoint. I think one of the things that we wanna look at in order to accomplish that is the types of units that we design into the project, because it's a very different situation if you have 10 single-family, 4-bedroom houses versus 10 two-bedroom units in a 2-story building. All the statistics that you hear from the people that study the demographics of school children say that you're gonna have 1/10 as many kids in the building with the 10 units as you are in the single-family units. So that, I think you can kind of design your result through, you can try to at least. I mean, I know that Lexington ended up with more school kids in their state hospital development than they expected and that were projected by the experts, but.
So my point was driven first by the state's projections, and I'm saying I don't think that's a good projection for Medfield. And secondly, I'm not suggesting we need 600 or 800 more students, but the fact is, if we're well below where we were in FY10, I'm only saying I don't think that is this kind of single-minded driver that it sometimes has felt like it was in the past.
The incoming classes are up in the 200 range. There was a time when the incoming classes were in the 160 range, but they're up in over the 200s now, so that we're getting back to a higher school population.
Still lower than historically, though. I mean, this year's first grade was 195, and the senior class is 232. That's less, like
Yeah,
37.
and there were times when my nephew's class was 275.
Right.
About 10 years ago, so.
Martha?
Yeah, I've looked a lot at the data as where it is, and definitely we are well below what our maximum population has been. But when you look at it school by school and grade by grade, Pete's right. The lower grades are getting back to the numbers that they'd been before, but the upper grades are still way below. So we do have capacity to put a lot more students in, but there's a cycle going on, and it's going to wave through. In 10 years, it's going to be, those little classes are going to be up. So we need to be cognizant. But there's no crystal ball, so no one's going to have the answer for sure.
So that's, at some point, I should sit down with somebody.
Yes.
And it'll probably take at least an hour and a half.
Yeah, no, we would like to get that and incorporate it into our markup, so thanks.
Anybody else have any questions or comments or anything to weigh in?
So I guess if I could just make a comment.
Please do, Pete.
I guess I would, having watched your process for 4 years, I'm very appreciative of all the committee members. Thank you guys exceedingly much for what you have done. I know it's a huge, huge labor, monumental task that you've accomplished. And so on behalf of the town, I just want to say thank you for doing that. I've always had sort of a different attitude towards the project than a lot of people, because the density doesn't bother me like some people. For me, what I'm looking for is the look and feel of a particular result. If the look doesn't change to me, I don't care if the density is greater. And so that if I'm looking at the economics of it, increasing the density doesn't bother me so much, as long as as the feel of the place doesn't change. Somehow I want it to be a place that will be a destination for people in Medfield, that will draw them there, and that they'll be interested in going there for whatever reason. Clearly, there are plenty of people that are going there now to walk their dogs, but hopefully that'll continue, and then maybe there'll be other reasons that people will want to seek out that spot, because the neighborhood looks interesting enough to walk around, or the arts center and the cultural center is holding a program, or there's a coffee shop, or whatever those reasons are. But I'm hoping that we'll create a destination that is of interest to the rest of the people in town, not just something that we're going to sell off units to the people that are going to come in to town from out of the area. So,
And I think that was a comment that we got a lot in the early phases, and talking to people broadly about different ideas, was the idea to have something there for the town, and the other is the destination idea to enhance the rest of the property. So both of those are, I think, key things.
So like Gus, I've got a number of sort of specific things that I can talk to you guys about at some point. That's sort of my major pitch, is that density isn't necessarily a deal breaker for me. more the way that it's going to appear.
Thank you. So I guess we'll be in touch with both of you about setting up a time somebody from the committee can sit down with you and take in your comments, and then when we do our global markup, we'll have those, because we really want that kind of feedback, so thank you.
So Steve, from your, you have further comments, Pete?
Well, just, I'm also curious as to how we're going to go from
ahead.
here. But, you know, that's just something that we're going to need to work out with this committee and,
Right. Yeah, there's some pretty big challenges ahead in how this is structured, and we allude to a lot of that in the master plan itself. You know, decisions about, are you going to dispose of everything at once, or large chunks of it, or or just pieces of it, and how you manage that, and how you're going to run the disposition process, things like that. So there's a lot for a new committee, I guess, an implementation committee to.
well, but I'd certainly like to get your input, your committee's input on the issues about the phasing and about the, because I'm concerned about if we spin off the arboretum because it's easy to do, how that affects the rest of the property's saleability and whether or not developers going to be interested in following up with the back 40 if the front is done by somebody else.
Yeah, those are some of the challenges we've kicked around a lot, and I know everybody on the committee seemed willing to participate in a discussion if there's a transition to a new group, to actually engage with that new group and share some of. I mean, some of this is fairly brief in here, but there's a lot more thinking that's gone on some of those kind of issues. And there's one thing I've concluded is there's no easy answer to those issues, but there's two sides to a lot of those approaches. So I think it just takes a certain amount of discussion, and then somebody's going to have to make the decision of which way is best for the town. So.
Yeah, well, and I would hope that somebody with more experience in real estate development than me can advise us as to the advisability of having parcels like the Arboretum spun off, and whether that is going to work in the long run or not.
Agreed.
However we get to that result.
I think that ball's in our court to figure out how we want to figure that part out.
I mean, it certainly can. I mean, all of it falls in our court to a great extent at this point. But I mean, obviously, there's a huge institutional memory now, and a resource here in this committee that I think that I'd like to talk to them about how they feel that the different pros and cons of the different ways of going forward at this point.
I think that's actually in here.
A lot of that is in there. I think beyond that, though, I think whoever takes the reins next, I think, should have professional help, number one, because unless you find some diamonds in the rough, it's a big challenge for almost any volunteer group without some kind of expertise. So, and we certainly have a fair amount of learning that we have done. We're amateurs too, though, but we're willing to share that.
So has the...
Jack's been trying to say something.
Oh, Jack, you want to jump in here?
Just a quick question. At one point in time, you had discussed getting additional developer input in this to sort of test the reality of this view versus what developers see. Gus, I certainly share your concern about the results of the Monte Carlo and the fact that theirs may or may not be attractive to developers. Is that still a thought on your parts?
It is on my part, yeah.
Yeah, I think from in the discussions we've had up till now, the question is, do we go with an RFI or not? And personally, I've gotten advice on both sides of that question. I can say that the advice I've gotten from the most experienced real estate developers, or people who have talked to the most experienced real estate developers, has been on the side of moving ahead with an RFI. I think, Mike, in at least a couple of our meetings, I think I see an RFI slightly different than my impression of how you've seen it, as an RFI as more planning. I don't see the RFI as more planning. I actually see the RFI as a testing out with developers who would not be precluded from applying, from responding to an RFP, to give us upfront advice on how to structure the RFP in the way that it would make it the most likely to generate responses from the greatest number of appropriate developers we can. So I see it as informing the RFP. In the plan here, there is a section toward the back that talks about disposition in the two-phase approach where you have the RFP and pre-qualify. I'm looking at it from a practical standpoint. The three of us have an issue of how do we set up this follow-on committee. That's gonna, I'm guessing, take us a while to sort out. I'm hoping some people are watching on this meeting on video here besides here, because a comment from our last town meeting is that the funding for the development of the the state hospital was turned down. So $75,000 wasn't approved. I think it was due to frustration on the part of some voters saying, well, we haven't seen anything happen there, so no more money for you. The problem is that, as a practical matter, could push this redevelopment out for another year, and it costs us $150,000 a year just to maintain the property. So I'm looking at it saying, but as a practical matter, we don't have that funding. We may have something coming in to do part of it, but in a way, we actually have time to go after an RFI because we probably don't have the funds to provide that professional help you're talking about with what didn't get approved in this year's town meeting. And I certainly hope at our next town meeting or our next year's town meeting that we can get that message out, that it's not just something you can pull the plug on and say, well, we're not putting anything into it. We own it. We have to take care of it, and that was probably not the most financially prudent decision, even though I think I understand why it happened.
So I think as from a process, do you have anything else, Pete?
No.
So
Are you gonna weigh in on this, or is Mr. Nolan ready to yield before? I'd like to say.
I was gonna, if we're gonna get to the Carthago Delenda Est portion of this program, I'd like to wait for that, and I have a few questions about it before, and then I'll give you your opportunity. But for now, I do have some questions for Mr. Nolan directed to some of the process here, and then, so from the perspective of the committee, Steve, have you all settled on what you think we would be voting on at a town meeting in the fall?
I think the essence of what we have is the appendix with the zoning bylaw, which then sets the stage for disposition. And then I guess the question is for whatever body, whether it's you or another committee, to decide on what and how to dispose. It may be premature to have that on town meeting this fall unless someone's got a pretty good plan that they want to put forward that everybody can coalesce around. But right now, this sets the stage, but opens up a lot of questions about how to implement it. So I think the zoning would be really helpful because for everything I hear from developers, if the town shows the will to rezone, that sends a huge signal that the town's willing to redevelop this. And until you have that kind of vote, because we really don't, aside from buying it, which was an inherently ambiguous vote because some people will claim that everybody voted for it so that it would never be developed, and some people claim that they wanted to have maximum development. So
Everyone voted for it, the reasons that I voted for it.
Exactly.
That's why
something like that. So, and I think Gus and I prepared the presentation and feel like it was kind of a middle road is what we put forward, and whether people were thinking that was real or not in their mind when they voted, who knows? But until you really get down to brass tacks and adopt some kind of zoning that allows this thing to go forward, I don't think developers are going to be as interested as you'd like them to be, because I think they won't see the signal, and they're going to say, what am I doing? I'm going to bid on something that they may take 3 years for the town to decide whether they're going to rezone it, and then they might vote no, so why am I going to waste my time? So I do think that the zoning is kind of the critical piece to unlock some of the potential up there.
Because my concern with it, and it's the same concern I have with the RFI, which is sort of, what are you doing with it right now? If you think, I mean, is this, in your view of how developers would react simply to rezoning, I mean, what is that based on?
That's what I do for a living.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand, I mean, whether you have, so you think if we rezone it, that will,
I mean, it's in most real estate development that I've been involved in, that's like the critical element, because it is the one thing, especially in towns, as opposed to cities where you might have a city council where the mayor may largely control that kind of vote.
Right.
But in a town with open town meeting, every developer is just like thinking, this is not real until I can hear town meeting vote it. And a lot of towns, this would just go down in flames, and other towns would maybe readily endorse it. So until they sort of know which way we're headed, they're not going to be all that interested, and they're not going to sink in a lot of money, because responding to RFPs or even RFIs, but especially RFPs, is a pretty labor-intensive job for a project of that size. So people aren't going to do that lightly if they don't think the town's really committed, and I don't think anything speaks commitment more than rezoning it, so.
And my question is more, because I've kind of been on the assumption that, given the flexibility that you've proposed, and I've not been through all of the appendices that you sent yesterday, that there's still a lot of questions left unanswered by the zoning, in the sense that, I mean, you've sort of zoned it, and it's a little bit like the purchase of the property, in that you zone it flexibly enough, and everybody can imagine that the thing that's going to happen there is the thing that they want to have happen. Alternatively, everyone can imagine that the thing that will happen there is the thing they don't want to have happen there, and so they're just going to vote no. Right? You don't know how people are going to react to that. I mean, and so kind of my view of it has been that if a lot of this is being left to disposition, and the zoning is going to be very flexible, and that's why I want your input as to why the zoning, because I've just been under the assumptions I've said before, that unless you are actually disposing of land, you are still in a planning process of one kind or another.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you 100%. I mean, the two votes would be if they voted, the town meeting voted for the selectmen to dispose of any or all of the site on conditions that the selectmen found to be most advantageous to the town. Then you're really talking, so I agree with you.
That's unlikely.
I think that's the problem. I think, I mean, in my experience, and of course, who can predict, a town likes to kind of know what the parameters are going to be of the disposition. So that is the hard part. So
Because I've just been thinking of this from the standpoint of, you really have to do both of them together. One without, and so I was interested to hear you say that you think the zoning might be sufficient, because kind of my take on it has been you really have to have both, right? Because particularly if you're going to have zoning that's going to allow a wide range of outcomes, the rubber really is going to hit the road in what the RFP says, in what the disposition authority is.
well, I mean, an interesting
Particularly if
model.
we're talking about phasing, and which
Right.
again, my view on the feasibility of this plan is the same as it was, which is it's not a feasible plan. And so that if this is the plan, it should be a single fee simple disposition of the whole property. I mean, I don't see any evidence that this is a feasible plan, but that's a separate question. But just from what we're aiming towards in the fall town meeting.
We did have a meeting with Buzz Constable, who worked in Lexington. Is that right, Gene? Gene set that up, and it kind of opens our eyes a little bit to a different process, which I'm not arguing for necessarily. But the town did say we're disposing of this, and they took bids, and they chose a developer, worked with the developer, and then got the town meeting vote, because their argument was the town will really see what it is, kind of what you're saying. The town will see exactly what's proposed, and then they vote on that. And if the density's higher, but as Pete said, it looks really good, and it has the same kind of look and feel, people may be more than happy to go with, 400 units that looks great up there. I don't know, but so there's not just one right process to get there. So, but I think that rezoning shows that the town's serious about doing it, and it's very flexible, so developers will look at it and say, well, this town really means to redevelop this, and they adopted zoning that allows them to do a lot of stuff, and so this is a real process that they're going through. Not as great as if you had a pretty blank check on disposition, so they knew that everything was in your hands. That would be the best, but I think the likelihood of that is a lot less if you put all that right on the table to start.
Right, because I mean, and 'cause the other piece of the problem then with the RFI is, if the idea is the RFI is supposed to in some way to inform the zoning, then you'd be looking to do that before. If the idea is we only want an RFI within the parameters of the zoning, saying we're going to do something within the zoning, this layout, this footprint, we're going to declare half the property off limits entirely, and we want this relatively prescriptive plan, then maybe the RFI will help around the margins. But it seems to me if you're going to go through an RFI process, you'd want to get input on the zoning piece of it as well, if the zoning piece is that important. And so I've been hesitant on the RFI because, not to repeat myself, but I think the big blocker here has been the fact that this has been under discussion for 15 years and nothing has happened. And if we're going to extend the planning process beyond a fall town meeting, and maybe you're right, Gus, that I'm misunderstanding what an RFI would do, and if it's not going to inform the zoning, then maybe it's a helpful footnote. I just don't know what use it has if it's not going to impact the zoning piece of it as well.
Given the flexibility of the zoning, I doubt that an RFI would result in getting feedback from someone saying, we think you should have more restrictive zoning here. So part of the reason why I think it's important for the master plan to be credible enough in the public's eyes that the public will vote for the zoning, but once that zoning's there, that's very flexible. What's of greater concern to me is before we go to a specific structured RFP, I think we have some strategic questions to ask around, do we go with a master developer and it's a single project, or do we try to parcel it out ourselves? I do have an opinion, but we're not talking about that yet. The RFI, as I saw it, well, let me give you, this is one that'll get your committee mad because of the example I'm gonna use, but that's okay. Just for the fun of it, you put out an RFI before we ever have an RFP. We provide, presumably, this is a plan that would be provided. A developer comes in and says, you know what? You have some plans up there in that northwest corner for those 2 buildings that you want to take down, and I know you don't plan to build anything in the north field, but I got this concept. And here's the concept, and I think you should rethink how you've zoned or how you're planning to use the north field. And you should actually consider giving me not just these 2 things, but this is what I want to put there. And we look at it and go, gosh, that never crossed our mind that anyone could do that. The RFI for me is something that basically goes to the developers, and yeah, we're gonna get a sanity check on the density. They're gonna, if they all laugh at us, then okay, why put the RFP out and have us laughed at? Why not get it with the RFI? But it's the fact that I don't think we've really brought the developer voice in as strongly as it ultimately needs to get brought in. And I would prefer to bring that developer voice in pre-RFP, rather than send something out there and go, yeah, we only got it 75% right, now we gotta figure out what to do with, is this a non-responsive proposal? Because we kinda like it, but it's not what we said we were gonna do, and then you get all the agitation across the town about, that's not what we thought your plan said. That's, my interest is in getting that one piece of it's the hard-nosed economic viewpoint that says, yeah, I know what you want, but you can't get, a Corvette for a Celica price, and that's what you're trying to do. And by the way, we have a couple of other ideas of things you hadn't thought about, and if you would be flexible about this, we could maybe do something that you might like, and it's to open up that possibility. And the fact that we're kind of sitting dead in the water for a year anyway, it would be something constructive to do that's not tied into actually being able to have to put an RFP out that's got money behind it.
Right, that sounds to me though, Gus, like an RFI you would do before we did the zoning.
I don't think it has to wait till after the zoning is
Well,
over.
I don't think you'd want to do it after the zoning, because then, to your example, the North Field is currently being zoned for grass in the plan, right? So if the developer comes back and says not grass,
Well,
then
that's one
we're
of
gonna
my,
have
so
to
that's one of
redo
my
the zoning.
point, that's one of my detailed comments, is both the zoning for there and for the Great Lawn, but not, so that you all know, now that I'm gonna be mad, not so that we can go and have massive development on the North Field, but or on the Great Lawn, but in order to have the flexibility that if a developer came in and said, I could really use the northwest corner of that Great Lawn, well, sorry, it's zoned, it's not zoned for it, come back next year. I'm trying to avoid, micro obstacles.
But if you think about that from a process
No, I agree with you
perspective,
about that.
I know you do. No, it's the North Field, same concept.
I think if you
The sledding hill stays with me.
if you put out a proposal to town meeting, then that increases the density in the developable part, I think you run the risk that you lose the zoning altogether. If you do the zoning that's more limited, you go out for an RFP or an RFI, whatever it is, but you still need a disposition vote. There's no problem with amending your zoning. Zoning is not set in stone, and it's easy enough in this way this is organized to tweak some of the uses in some of those sub-districts when you do your disposition vote, which Mark told me is also a 2/3 vote. So if you're gonna have the consensus at a town meeting to dispose of it because they like your proposal, I don't see any reason why people wouldn't tweak the zoning to enable the proposal they're voting on. But I think you run a real risk if you try to maximize the flexibility by saying we can develop every square inch up there. I think you'll get a real negative reaction because there was a lot of,
But why couldn't it be that the zoning is flexible, but we declare that we want 50 acres to be unbuildable? You can pick the 50 acres rather than, this plan says, not to get into the weeds on this, and I've said this before, but this plan says these are the 50 acres that shall be grass, right? And so if you want it to be something other than grass, you've got to come back to us and rezone it and do something else. Another way to do it would be to say, to expand the zones, and then say, but we want in total for this plan to be 50 acres of open space or 50 acres of public land, and then at least you're entertaining proposals, to Gus's point, from a developer who might have a more creative way of dealing with the infrastructure that brings down the cost, right? I mean, because I'm certainly not going to be in favor of a plan that assumes $28 million of taxpayer money to make it even marginally successful, right? I mean, that's there's no reason to do that. So, I mean, I think some measure of flexibility in the zoning might prompt further input or creative work from developers, assuming the town wants to go in something like this mix of use.
Well, I mean, that's a whole, taking flexibility to a whole nother level, which, there's no right or wrong, but at least I think the committee didn't feel like all acres up there are even and equal. And so there are some that have more desirable attributes than others that people wanted to respect. So, but you could do higher density within the areas that are developable. I mean, so that's another possibility. It's not, you don't necessarily have to throw open all the square footage to development. And say that's better. I mean, I can't imagine that the North Field is going to be so much easier to develop from an infrastructure point of view, because it's even further away from the infrastructure we have, and you've got the whole core campus in between. So unless you were going to say we're going to develop that, and then the developer has to reduce the entire core campus to a pasture to replicate the open space, it doesn't seem to make as much sense to us to do that.
Mike and I are slightly different on this, because I'm not just neutral about, 50 acres and you pick where you want it to be. For me, it's the default issue. So where the argument you're making is, well, let's zone it open, so the default is we won't do anything, and then if something has to happen, then through disposition we can change the zoning. I'm saying, actually, when we're going out to developers, I would like the default to be that is not off the table. Now, there's something we want built here. I'm not trying to set up higher densities or bigger development. I'm actually simply trying to provide some flexibility to a developer. If there's a concept out there, and in the northwest corner is kind of an interesting one, because there's these two throwaway buildings, and ultimately it was going to be high value housing anyway. So if there's a developer out there that says, gee, if you can give me this piece that's bleeding over, it's kind of like what we're doing with the Hinckley property, we're getting part of the Council on Aging, it's that kind of a incremental thing is where I'm coming from,
Right.
where the default, so my response would be, and then after the disposition, we can do a zoning change for everything else that's left, that's back to being open. I'm not really fighting the open space, I'm not fighting the view shed issue. I'm trying to send a message to developers that we have an idea, this is what we think we want, but we're trying to be as flexible as we can be to let you tell us the best ideas, but you can't get to redefine this whole thing to make it a 600-unit development. It's just, if there's something about the way we drew the lines, it's a problem. It's pretty easy for us to change that problem for you in the interest of getting this thing going.
But I would say to that point, I mean, my view of it is more towards the non-residential pieces of it, right? That, to me, we ought to have greater flexibility around potential commercial development. So a commercial developer who wanted to put something in an area that's zoned for open space, I think we ought, given that that's an actual need of the town, that this number of increased residences is not an actual need of the town. I mean, the affordable portion of it is an actual need, but it's a low percentage compared to what we've been doing. So you're getting very few affordable units for a very large number of residential units. And I'm assuming in any plan that the lowest number of residential units that we're going to have in this plan is going to be the day the plan is adopted. And that as we go through the process with the developer, I mean, it's not complicated. I mean, they're going to, the math is simple, right? The more houses, the more money for the developer, the more they're going to pay for them. And it's sort of the fewer houses, the less. It's not, whatever's in the black box model, that's what it says, right? I mean, if
Right.
this were zoned RS and we sold it for 100 acres, no buildings on it, we could probably get $50 million for it, right? So, and some developer would be thrilled to put 600 houses up there. And I don't think anybody would think that would be a great outcome for the town. We could have had that outcome 10 years ago or 12 years ago with no outlay of money from that. So my way of thinking of it, when you look at the actual needs of the town for diversification of the tax base, for diversification of the housing stock, somewhat more towards senior housing, and the need for the fulfillment of the housing production plan. So those are sort of the three metrics of actual needs of Medfield and how that's going to be driven by this. And so in terms of flexibility, to me, I'd be more flexible around something that satisfied those needs at no cost to the taxpayers, And so without having to have a cash outlay from the taxpayers, if a developer came in and said, look, I can do it this way, and you're not gonna have to hand me $28 million, right? I mean, right now, we're sort of assuming we're gonna hand to the developer $28 million one way or the other, right? Probably not necessarily from a straight tax outlay, but from what would otherwise be public revenue.
Where
And
would you put that? I'm having a hard time picturing commercial development on any of this open, I don't know what the commercial development will look like on any of the open space we're talking about.
I mean, one thing is that all our surveys said highest and best use is residential, and we had our developers roundtable. They were all residential developers. I mean, there's not a lot of people, despite all our outreach, that are clamoring to do a commercial development. We've put a lot of commercial in there that our consultant said is way more than you can support. And in fact, the core campus is largely zoned so you could do things like office and mixed use in almost all the buildings. It's not restrictive, but the idea of doing raw land commercial development isn't contemplated here. I'll agree with you on that.
no, I know that. And all I'm saying is that it may be that nobody would want to do that. But, we've had developers interested in sports complexes in town, right? And so if someone were to say, hey, there's a lot of room there and a lot more room than there are other places, and so I want to put my sports complex there.
That's a complicated subject in and of itself.
Well, but I'm just talking about, you don't need to deal with the other half of the complication there. I'm just talking about, from a commercial standpoint, that's something that is a use that has been proposed for the town on Lot 3, for example, right? But Lot 3 is a lot smaller than what's here. And those are, low margin, high volume places, and so the bigger they are, the more money you make. Now, I'm not gonna say that's necessarily gonna happen, right? But that is something that I could see slotting in places on the campus. Now, would people love it and say, that's great, that's awesome? Some people would, other people wouldn't. All I'm suggesting is, given what the town needs in the long run, and I think there is a general consensus that if we can do it responsibly, we do need some diversification of our tax base. Given the fact that I don't think our schools are getting cheaper, I don't think that money from the state is going to be becoming more plentiful, and so if we want to be able to maintain some measure of some socioeconomic diversity, there's got to be a way of not putting all of the tax burden on residences, and so.
And one of the ways of doing that is to build housing that does not have a lot of children in it. And my example is always Old Village Square, which has, last I heard, one school child in 47 units that are producing $600,000 a year to the town. So the town is making more than $500,000 a year out of those 42 units. So, I mean, if you plan the right sort of housing, I think you can, I'm going to be very curious to see what number of children we end up with at the Larkin development.
The over-under is a lot. I would guess probably 75 or 80 would be when that's
Is that
built
right?
out.
Out of-
I mean,
out
they're
of 49
residential
houses?
family houses. I mean, Old Village Square is high-end housing for, it's not particularly family-oriented, right? I don't know what the capacity is
Well,
in
the-
Medfield for super high-end housing for non-families.
Do we have any actual statistics as to school children that have bought in there already or
I think
not?
there are already more than there are at Old Village Square,
Yes, I think we already have 8,
Eight-
in like 3 houses.
and 3 houses and nobody's living there yet.
3 houses with 8 kids?
That's gonna be,
That's gonna be different then,
yeah.
yeah.
So, that's sort of my take on the flexibility piece of it, that I wouldn't want to be flexible in location just to build more houses. I mean, I just don't see that as a great need of the town. We have, I mean, to Gus's point, we've got a lot of housing for families. Most of the housing that we have in Medfield is conducive and directed towards families. And so, more of that is not necessarily, even though that might get us the top dollar in the short run, I don't necessarily see a huge long-term benefit. It's certainly not a long-term benefit enough to the town to commit $28 million of public money or $25 million of public money towards that. That.
And I'm not trying to shoot for more housing. If you take the Larkin project that's on the market for $800,000 to $1 million a unit, suddenly you say, and you know what, they're next to the really nice property, which is the state hospital. And you start thinking about, well, if suddenly we've got the plans that we have, but if around, I picked the northwest corner just because suddenly somebody comes in and says, you know what, I'd like to put 3 $1.8 million homes up there. Now, none of us have those, and so that's not really what we're worried about providing. But to Pete's point, if for 3 houses you have 3 $1.8 million homes, they're taxed at that valuation, probably no matter how many kids they've got. Well, except for one person.
I won't move it, I promise. It'll be well out of our price range, Gus, so.
But what I'm getting at is that's all that I'm getting at. It's not to add houses, it's that if somebody comes in with something we
Right.
just didn't think of that's
Right.
out of this, out of the zone.
Right. I mean, the hard part is that part of the Medfield housing market is the softest part of the market. Right? If you look at the houses that have sat the longest time on the market in Medfield, they're $1 million and up. If it's under, so a developer is really going to be looking to build in that sweet spot where the Larkins are, and that 6 to 8, where the houses go really fast. And I think, and I agree with you. I mean, I think you look at that back corner there, you can see, and maybe that will be a piece of this in the long run. But that is a soft part of the market. All right, we do have some time, and so just to wrap up before we get to comments, I mean, I am very concerned about what we do with the town meeting. And I think we do have to decide on the RFI, because I don't know, I'd have to think about, and like your view on this too, Pete, is to, if we went with the zoning at the town meeting in the fall, some version of the zoning, and then issued an RFI, the idea we're gonna sort of use this period, and then issued an RFI, and that's what I kind of struggle with, is kind of what the sequence is.
My view is, we don't have to wait for the town meeting to do the RFI. We do the RFI to get feedback from the market, and then we do the RFP after the town meeting where the zoning has gone through, and we have more confidence that the RFP is actually sensitive to the considerations that developers would have, but is also structured to reflect what we've got in the master plan. So that's,
But I'm just struggling with the sequence. I mean, I would think if you're not gonna wait for the town meeting for the RFI, you would wanna wait for the RFI for the town meeting. So at least if there's if the response is, your zoning's all messed up, you gotta do something else, or if the consensus, and I don't think it's gonna be that, because I think this is probably, I mean, so much thought has gone into this, I doubt there's gonna be some big revelation on the zoning. But if that happened, then you sort of gone to town meeting, get an RFI that comes back, a week before town meeting, get an RFI that comes back, so your zoning's all messed up. Now you're at town meeting, forget about the zoning article, we're gonna be back to you and.
so I would agree with you if the zoning that the committee was recommending is that on the west side, we're gonna have residential, and on the east side, we're gonna have commercial, and it can only be, a special kind of artisanal cheese making in the north side, then I would agree with that, because maybe, that's not where it all belongs. But given its flexible zoning, I can't picture the scenario where the developers would come in and say, oh, your zoning's messed up because you give us too many options, which is what I think, that's why I've been so relaxed about it. It's like, listen, this kind of lets us do, we can't put a nuclear power plant up there, but, we can kind of do whatever we had envisioned. The real issue is, for me, is more a developer coming in and saying, you put the senior housing over here, if instead you put it over there, this would free up this linkage into this other piece. You didn't think about it that way, but, if you could do that, and we can say, yeah, actually, we could do that.
Well, I think that would probably be permitted. I think the boundaries of the subzones are probably, the boundaries and what's allowed in the subzone. So the Northfield and the green are sort of off limits under zoning, at least unless you changed them. The others, there's a lot of flexibility. You could flip the senior center to the other side. There are a lot of reasons why we put it where it was, but if a developer comes up with some great answer, you could easily flip that around. So a lot of that could happen. It's just a question of whether you preserve the Northfield and the green, and then on the south, where we have those 12 acres, Park and Rec made a huge point about those need to be municipal recreational uses, so that's what we have in this plan. But there's another area where you were talking about south of Hospital Road doing commercial. This plan wouldn't allow that, so.
That's to get into the details, that's one of the areas that I do, given it's 12 acres and Park and Rec needs about half of it. Again, giving away developable land just because Park and Rec doesn't want anything else there, if that's what's driving it.
I don't think they say they want to make sure they are there. So, I mean, for instance, if you did 6 and 6, they'd
Right.
probably be happy with that.
So my concern is the other 6, and it's not a violation of the agricultural predisposition. What I would see would work there is agricultural, but it's another commercial opportunity if it's structured the right way.
Yeah, so I mean, you could do, say half will be municipal recreation, half will be commercial, or, another range. You could certainly do that.
It seems to me, in that scenario, wouldn't we get the same thing back in response to an RFP? In terms of flipping, if the zoning authorizes the senior can be anywhere, And then instead of an RFI, you just issued the RFP, and the developer could still come back and say, I'm gonna have this mix of uses or that mix of uses in that spot or this spot. I mean, it seems like if you do have that flexible zoning, I don't know what the benefit of the interim RFI is as opposed to going directly from the zoning to an RFP.
Two things for me. One's the most straightforward one. If everybody in the RFI comes back and says, you guys are, well, it's okay now, you're smoking grass if you think you can get away with 300 units.
As long as you
and
bought
make
it someplace
work.
else
It's
outside
not
of
even a
Medfield,
dramatic
right.
statement anymore, I know, but, you know, if you got feedback in an RFI that just says your numbers are all screwed up, your whole concept is wrong, either you gotta not try to do the things you're trying to do, or you gotta deal with a different set of numbers. I'd kinda like to know that before the RFP, because I'd be worried that if it was an RFP and somebody was bidding, and they basically said, well, let's give them the bid for what we do, but when the numbers don't work, we're gonna sit there and come back in for higher density after we're committed. I would rather know we have that problem up front. The other reason, though, is on the off chance that there's a creative developer out there that just says, you know, you guys didn't see this thing that happened out in Minnesota, but we did this out there, and it's really cool, and we think you might want to consider that, even though that's not exactly what you carried in your plan. Then in an RFI, you'd have the ability to evaluate that, and perhaps if it's an RFI before a special town meeting, you could even modify the message. So I'm as much as anything, I would hate to see us do up there a completely predictable, logical, and uninspired job on what is a unique piece of property with a heck of a lot of assets associated with it. So I'm looking for as much as we push for the numbers, I'm also looking for evidence of the creative thought and make sure we've at least looked for it. So that, because I think part of the success of this is gonna be for us to do something there that nobody else can replicate.
So, you know, for me, one of the most useful things tonight is hearing Steve, as someone who does this professionally, tell me that for developers, the important thing is gonna be the zoning decision. And that's the same sort of a gut check that I'm looking for from the RFI to the developers, to get that sort of gut reaction as to what we're proposing up there. I'm also open to Gus's idea of getting other ideas. I think, to me, it makes more sense to do all of that before we do the zoning.
I see the water crew has arrived. So we'd raised, that came up earlier with the water and sewer issues. Bill, do you want to jump in here with any questions you have coming out of your meeting with respect to the hospital master plan?
Sure.
You can either wrestle the microphone away from Jack, or you can go up to the podium, wherever you want to go.
Okay. So for the record, Bill Harvey, Chairman, Water Sewerage Board. We just wanted to get in front of the Board of Selectmen. We actually have 3 issues. One of them is the hospital. 2 are just procedural. One is that we wanted to formally advise you that a motion was passed to recommend, belatedly, the odd and even water restriction pursuant to Medfield Article 270 and the Massachusetts Water Management Act, and in accordance to Medfield's water withdrawal permits. And that's, for my interpretation of this bylaw, it's up for the Selectmen's action to promulgate that as part of your action. So I just wanted to deliver that we deliberated and that motion was passed.
Did you do that tonight?
Yes.
So what was the basis of the recommendation?
That according to the flows in the river and according to our withdrawal permits, once the river comes down to a certain velocity, or it's measured in velocity, but it's basically in flow, that we need to go to a conservative path. And our first trigger for a conservative path is an odd and even water restriction.
And so when did that happen? When did that flow change happen that you mentioned?
So see, now all those notes are over there in that part of the room.
Ballpark.
But it was approximately around May 25th, 27th. It has to go below a certain limit for consecutive days. And it has gone below, it's pretty much stayed below that trigger for us ever since.
Okay. And so,
So-
this is consistent with the recommendation from the DPW director?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. And
Yes.
so,
Yeah, I
you're
think Mo
confirming
can
that
fill
you
in some
agree
more.
with his approach?
With the action, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can explain a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So with our Water Management Act permit, we have, it's 170 cubic feet per second that the river flows at, that we're good until. So it goes until June 30th. Once July hits, the level goes down to 62 is our limit. So at May 29th, it went down to 169. It has to go for 3 consecutive days. Once it goes to 3 consecutive days, we're required by a Water Management Act permit to institute some sort of conservation water restriction for the town. Our most lenient one is an odd-even water restriction. So we're in that right now. For 7 consecutive days, if it stays above that limit, we can put it back on. Right now, this morning, we're looking at, it was a 65 cubic feet per second down to 62, and our limit is 62 right now. So at 62, we're looking at, in 3 consecutive days, we're gonna have to put another, so if we put it back on and back off, back on, it's just gonna be very confusing for the town. So most likely it'll stay in effect until, if the drought management task force meets and decides that we're in a more severe drought, those restrictions could be more severe. It could go to a 1 day, a week, and eventually it could go to no watering. But we don't want to get to that point. But our tanks do suffer because with everybody watering together, our tank levels go down, which has less pressure to our system, which could be dangerous to our water supply. So right now with the odd and even, it helps us keep pumping and keeping the levels of the tanks up.
Okay.
Okay.
And so you need an enactment from us?
Yes.
Officially on the
yeah.
bylaw for the water ban?
With our permit, we have to comply with DEP, but officially, a vote from the selectmen in our bylaws would suffice.
Yeah,
Where's-
what
where's
we hope
Mark?
to do in the.
Did Mark leave?
No, he's
Oh,
in
he's
the
right.
back.
Is there? Yeah. Well, if I could just interject, what we hope to do is to give you more advance notice that we are on that trajectory and that the board would pass a motion to give you that advisory before it happens. We're behind, in doing that.
Mark, is it possible to make the enactment of this restriction from the board retroactive to the date compliance is required with the permit?
Do you have anybody you're trying to find?
It's
matter?
a practical matter. I don't see any particular purpose for that. It's a going forward. They want to see you actually implementing a conservation program. So as long as it, if it should have been done earlier, shame on us. But the fact is that we do it going forward.
Right, well, I know we posted it, Mo
Right.
posted it, Mo did what he was supposed to do, we just hadn't had a board meeting to deal with it, and I'm just saying from the bylaw perspective, would it be helpful to, or unnecessary to
I
make it
think
retroactive?
technically the bylaw says no later than June 1st. So you're really talking substantial retroactive
Yeah,
effect.
I think the way that article is written is that, I think it probably needs to be looked at, because it's not the way that we monitor our flows. That is a calendar year that's in our article, and I think that might be an artifact from wherever we took that language from.
From Franklin, and Franklin has a calendar.
Yeah,
as
and we
do
do
a
not
lot
have,
of
we do
towns.
not have a calendar. Ours is based on the stream flow itself, not on a calendar year. So I
Well,
think that.
the language
in the
isn't
future-
etched in stone. You're certainly free to revisit it and
Yeah.
revise it, propose revisions
Okay.
if you want. But
Yeah.
it is what it is for now.
Okay,
Right.
so,
So-
do we have a motion, Mr. Clerk?
I still have some questions,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
So,
We can get to the third item as well.
two things. This ban, because of the exchange of emails, I know more about this than I knew a week ago. This is called a conditional ban?
No, it's a conservation. It's water conservation measures.
So, okay. So the first question is at this level, is this a ban that if people violate it, the enforcement action,
With-
that we have to approve? That
With
they're
the
subject to
selectmen's,
fine?
with the selectmen's approval, it becomes enforceable.
Okay.
Yes.
So no matter what level the ban is, they're all enforceable if people aren't in
That's right.
compliance with that?
Right,
Okay.
and that's as per the articles that were passed at the recent,
Yeah,
at the
okay.
recent
Okay.
public meeting, that
Okay.
what is promulgated becomes enforceable.
Okay. Then the next set of questions I have to do with operational questions. So as a practical matter, you all, the water department is monitoring stream flows so that you would detect being below the stream flow?
For three consecutive days, then we can,
Okay.
DEP will recommend us to put it on our website and put out a restriction.
Okay. And so what's going to happen, if in the future, if this, you have 3 days below the flow, you're going to put this right on your website at that point and announce?
Correct.
The
So,
ban.
so DEP kind of supersedes our bylaws, okay?
Right. So then my next question is, I think what triggered this one was a call from DEP this week?
Correct.
Were they reacting to information you were providing
To the
them?
stream flow.
So it was your information that went to them?
It's their information on their stream flow that triggered that we didn't have anything on our website at the time, that they had called us, just a friendly reminder to get it on our website. We put it on our website.
So DEP and our DPW are both using the exact same
Correct.
monitoring station?
Correct.
You're looking at the same data?
Correct.
Okay, got it. If you have 3 days in a row, you put it on the website, what I'm trying to get an operational question here, on when does this ban actually get put out to the public? Sounds like if we were doing
It's,
it right.
on
you
the
would do it-
website, it's sufficient for DEP as long as it's on the website.
Okay.
We did put the signs out because our tanks were running lower than normal,
Okay.
just to show everybody that we did need to do
Okay.
water conservation.
So I understand how the operational side of this works. Bill, as far as the Water and Sewerage Board works, is that what you want them to do? So you're gonna have, if you
Yes.
have to pass a
So-
motion, you're gonna pass
so,
a motion
right,
after
so-
the fact.
So how do we operationalize this?
Right.
First is, as we come into this time of year and we have our normal board meetings, which are approximately every 4 weeks, is we're going to talk about this. And we're going to look at the trajectory of this. Frankly, we should have seen the trajectory before this was coming, but it actually, the stream flows fell really quickly. If you actually, in mathematical terms, they plot it in a log function, which means it drops quite a bit faster than just a smooth line. How we're going to operationalize this is we're just going to review this as a board and with the department so that we can advise the selectmen that this is an impending situation before it actually happens. Whereas this time, it happened before we actually, before we were in that condition before it was posted.
So that's fine. As a
We got it
practical,
covered.
as a practical matter, I'm pretty sure the water department can look at the same thing DEP's looking at, and if the number is below the number, and it's 3 days in a row, you're gonna do what you do without any checks, approvals, or anything.
everyone that,
The board, once that's happened, you're gonna have to let the board know that's happened. When you guys meet, the only circumstance I mean, you may need to formally approve through a motion, but the only circumstance where I can see that's important at all is if for some reason you're in violent disagreement about the way they read those meters, and you wanna tell us, don't, this is wrong, take the signs down, right? So in a sense, it may be a requirement of the bylaw to do this, but it's kind of a no-brainer.
Well, what is the question you're asking?
So it starts.
Right, it sounded like you're telling me a question or you're asking me an
Oh, it
answer.
starts with, I'm starting with
What does he want them to do?
I'm starting with a statement.
Right.
What I'm trying to get is.
I'm not a
what I-
lawyer, but I know I should
Well,
answer a
neither am I.
question.
You're my friend. I'm not. These guys are, but I'm not.
All right.
What I'm getting at is there's a matter of reading a meter, and if the meter reads 3
Right.
days in a row below where it needs to read, then that triggers the ban, or the conservation restriction. As a practical matter, I'm not trying to yank your chain in terms of having emergency meetings in response to that. I'm saying, when I think about you on the Water and Sewerage Board, being informed of that ban, assuming that whoever's monitoring that is capable of reading that number 3 days in a row and evaluating it properly, at that point, if the bylaws call on the Water and Sewerage Board to make a recommendation, which is what you put in your email, I'm saying that's fine, that's compliance with the bylaw to make sure that
Right.
for some reason,
Right.
the water department's not going rogue, but that should be a straightforward action. That wouldn't, I'm trying to picture, are there circumstances where that would not be a straightforward action on the part of the Water and Sewerage Board?
I can't answer that. I can hypothesize that that might be where the data might be wrong, and we might dispute it. Any reasonable person would look at the data and say, that meter's wrong. Hello, DEP, can you check that meter, because it's reading 0?
Okay.
So that, I
But
don't
that'd be
think.
something you'd be working with the Water Department to figure
Possibly,
out.
or it's trending dramatically more. While it's raining like crazy,
Yeah.
it's still dropping, so it's a calibration problem.
Okay.
Okay. From the Water and Sewer Board, we have enterprise funds, and they're self-sustaining funds. We cannot go back to the taxpayers for money, so that we want to make sure that if our customers can buy water and we can supply water, we're going to supply that water, and we have to cover debt and operating expenses on a continuous basis. We want to make sure that if the readings that are coming out of this website and this probably single or maybe 2 meters, that they actually are working. We don't want to automatically reduce what we can sell to the public because there's a mistake somewhere, because it affects our revenues, and we don't want to have a revenue shortfall, as well as having the DPW run around and put up signs and have to take them all down because someone had to recalibrate something. So it's a little bit of a check and balance, I would think. And the board is also known for, having meetings, quickly during times of fast action or crisis. So if this was coming up, we would get together.
My point wasn't to yank your chain about having meetings.
No, but you
faster,
did.
What I'm trying
No.
to understand is, well, I really
No,
not
no,
trying
no,
to
I
get
get
you to do
it.
that.
I
What
get
I'm
it.
trying to do is,
Right.
you're coming to us with a recommendation. We're going to take a vote because that's what's required by the bylaws for the enforcement action.
Right.
I don't think any of the three of us are going to have a personal opinion about whether you did the
Right.
job the right way, or whether MORA or the Water Department. We're going to sit there and say, okay, we understand. You came to us and you told us this. We're going to
But
act on
I think
it.
the question within the question is, why is it really required, and why was the article written? And I think our legal counsel could probably tell you why.
Can I, before you get there, so
Yeah.
my version of that question is, what is it you want the DPW to do pending your meeting? You want them to wait? And this, let's say you couldn't have a meeting right away. If the water permit says we're supposed to go to a conservation restriction, do you want them to wait until you've had a meeting and a vote, until we've had a meeting and a vote?
The way that we're going to operationalize this is to look at the data on a real-time basis. And if we see it trending toward that area, then we will impanel a meeting.
Okay,
That's
so
the way
you-
that we're
so
going to
your
do it.
view is
We
you want
it
them
to
to
be
wait until you've had a meeting, until we've had a meeting.
All truth be told, this should have been.
Bill, can I interrupt?
Yeah, we could have
Can I
anticipated it.
interrupt you real
Yeah,
quick? I think that it's getting a little muddy.
right.
When we hit the 3 days, the permit obligation is in effect. It's done. You have to put the signs up, we have to
Right.
get the information up on the website. It's done.
That answers my
The purpose
question.
of the
Thank
enforcement
you.
is our ability to enforce.
Right.
And without our vote and your vote, we don't have that ability.
That I get entirely. I'm just trying to
So,
make
yeah.
clear here that Mo did exactly what you want him to do in putting the signs up when the measurement came through. You didn't want him to wait until you had a meeting, until we had a meeting, correct? Yes, that's what I'm trying to get clear.
So the
Mo,
calendar,
good job.
Well, yeah,
so the calendar model is clean insofar as you know, May 1, say, conservation measures have to go into effect and they extend until September. That's what a lot of towns do. If you're gonna go to the water flow method as the trigger, that's fine, but from my standpoint, from an enforcement standpoint, you can't be flipping a light switch on and off. Once you vote that, then that's in place absent some really, like the wettest summer on record. You know, you're not gonna be putting it on, putting it off. This is basically a bylaw with monetary penalties for violation potential.
right. But what we're trying to balance is a reasonably reliable revenue profile when our customers are asking for water and we can supply it, that we are going to sell it.
Look at a
to-
bigger picture, because every
so-
other community in the Commonwealth is in exactly the same position.
Right, and we are not every single community, so we are different, okay?
And
So
special.
That's right.
Pete, do you have any questions?
So
about this?
anyhow, so,
Well, I'm just looking forward to hearing if we need to change our bylaw or operationally how it's going to work.
I would recommend
The
it.
selectmen in
Yeah.
the future.
I think we might want to think about it again. It's probably not the time to do it. We are in the middle of we're executing as planned. I don't see an emergency session that we have to do that.
So you have another issue.
I have two.
So let's
You
finish
had the
this one
hospital, you had the water
first.
ban, and you had a third issue.
Yeah,
Before.
that's right. No. So, it's my interpretation that that Jeremy Marsette's term has expired, and we are now with just 2 formal board members. So it's a question of twofold. One is, if we still meet with just 2 out of the normal 3, is that an appropriate, and is that an appropriate quorum? And if not, we would like some assistance from the selectmen in filling that vacancy or temporarily becoming part of the board at that capacity until another board member is found.
Pretty sure a quorum of 2 is better than a quorum of 1.
Yeah.
I can relate to you that the town council is nodding his head that
Two is a
two is a quorum.
Okay.
He's not volunteering to be on the water and sewer. board. So we need a third, you need a third member.
Right, right. Well, it gets to if one of us can't make it, then
Right.
it becomes problematic. You know,
Any
we-
water
yeah.
engineers in the room or out there in the public, please contact us, right? We're looking for a
Sure.
new member of the Board of Water and Sewer. Do you have anyone, do you have any candidates, or, probably not, right?
No,
Okay.
it's something that, it's something that we actively and passively try to.
We have a volunteer. We have a motion that Jack Wolf is appointed to the Water and Sewer Board.
This is not volunteer.
Right.
I
But
would just like to commend the room for the thoroughness.
We're not done with the first topic yet.
Right.
It's okay, so move on.
All right, so you're looking for new water and sewer, was that item number
Yeah,
3?
Yeah, that's true.
So
We
back
are
to
looking
the
at
water
that.
ban. Do you have anything else on the water ban, guys?
Typically, what happens, people do join as an associate member just to get their literally feet wet. No, pun intended. But it is, because there is, I come from the private sector, and it took me 3 years to understand the parliamentary aspects of what is done, in the public sector. So I'm not trying to be diminutive by calling it parliamentary, but actually in England that's a compliment. So I got to stop. As they say, when you get in a hole, you have to stop digging. I'm going to stop digging.
It's all right, there's no parliamentarians here.
right.
Back to the water ban. Gus, do you have anything further on the water ban?
Let me just kind of sum this up. The reason I'm reacting to this is there were an awful lot of emails that took a lot of my time, and I was chasing my tail, to be honest with you. But I want to propose something that I think, I'm not trying to force it, I'm just trying to understand and get to somewhere. The actual process of determining whether or not there needs to be a conservation restriction is a process that should be carried out by the water department, should be handled by basically delegated to the water department in terms of on-the-ground decision about when that gets called. The Water and Sewerage Board needs to meet to confirm that declaration of conservation at whatever time you're able to meet. I understand, if you think there's some fundamental flaw in how that decision was made, then it's appropriate to challenge that decision, and if necessary, to send that up and say, we disagree with this thing that got declared, and here's why. I'm kind of sympathetic, I think, with Mark around I recognize you're trying to make sure you sell water, but the idea that in the first 2 weeks of June, there'd be a ban, and then the water came in, and so now we're okay, and we're gonna let you buy water for the 3rd month of June, and then it gets warm again, and we have a ban back on. I can see the problems that will create with the public. Right now, the public's conditioned. When those signs come up at the beginning of the summer, it's odd even watering. They still get to use water, it's just they have to do it. And
That's right.
and the idea of sending back and forth signals is gonna be a problem.
I think that's exactly it, that the way the article is written is on a calendar.
Okay.
and then afterwards, then more signs go up. So it's a question of, are we in a water restriction or not? And if you're John Q. Public driving down the road, I didn't see any signs. There's no signs, you know, up there. So the fact that it's a calendar is somewhat arbitrary.
Okay. Well, so if there's a change to bylaws, I'm happy. What I'm really trying to do is basically get the operational side delegated to there.
It always
I'm
has
not trying
been,
to
yeah.
undermine your efforts to make sure you sell water.
That's right.
But I'm hearing and viewing that vote of your board, generally 95% of the time, is going to be a confirmation of what the water department does. I understand the bylaws require us to vote and accept or not accept your recommendation in order to put the enforcement
Right.
action.
I mean,
But
to
that
think
should
about
be-
it, what circumstance would we do if the readings are showing that the river is low, but we all know that it's high, and we automatically trust what's on that website when the numbers are wrong,
Yeah.
and then you have to start fining people. That would be a real big problem.
Yeah,
So
okay.
that's just part of it's just a small check and balance, that's all. Not just from an operations point of view, but from a fiduciary point of view.
Okay. All right.
So,
I'm ready to vote on this.
You have a motion?
all right.
I have a motion, we accept the Water and Sewerage Board's recommendation to declare a water conservation condition.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
Aye. All right. And now, I assume your third issue is MSH.
Yes, the board members all live in Medfield, and it's, of course, we are all familiar in general with the interest in developing the hospital property. But the board's concerned that that there really hasn't been enough analysis or advisory to the board about the impact or the needs of what's being developed on this property and the cost thereof of connecting it to our infrastructure and any cost that would be borne by the existing ratepayers. We just haven't seen any study or analysis that would show the hard data on the demand profile from water, from a seasonal perspective, or broken down by the demographic, whether it is residential or commercial, both the seasonal variations, because we are challenged to meet drinking water volumes as it is right now. The data that was first put in front of us was in January of this year, and by a consultant, and we accepted the information, but we asked for more details, and they were going to be more forthcoming. So it's not clear to us that if the costs that are being considered and estimated for your developers as a utility cost, whether that is being seen as just what's up in what I call the hospital island, so to speak, or is it also include all of this infrastructure that's going to connect those properties to water and wastewater? We have no information that. We don't know of any studies that have been prepared by any of the hospital development committees, and we've never been or invited to any of the planning committees thus far. So
You have had meetings with, have you met with the committee at all?
No.
How'd you get the consultant's information?
The consultant came in on January 18th and presented the draft plan and some water needs, and we discussed it with them, but.
That was at one of your meetings.
Yes, it was one of our meetings, yeah. That's the only interaction that we've had on all of this. And so our concern is that, just on the face of it, just on this study, and this is dated, that it's at least a 15% increase in the drinking water needs and, a proportionate increase in the wastewater volume needs. So we're not aware of any study of our infrastructure that would support the demand for these services at this time. And if it is, we'd like to see it and analyze it. And if it hasn't, then we would encourage the town to either have that become part of the developer's cost to analyze the infrastructure and the connection thereof, or someone's got to pay for it. Especially as we look at, if I can finish, we're looking at our 10 and 20-year CapEx plan and operating plan. We have a number of projects, and if all of a sudden we have a large demand for water and sewage service in one part of the town that would sort of distort our service model, we sort of need to know that. We need to plan for that, especially as we look at our projects in time. Water's not like electricity. Water is made here and it's consumed here. You just can't bring it on a wire that's made from a solar farm 300 miles away. That's what makes water different than any other utility. It's heavy to move, it's expensive to move with electricity. So what you have and what we have here is, something to be treasured and also something to be managed in parlance with the rest of the development of the town. So we're here just to express that we want to be more connected to the process, because just, we need to have that sort of visibility and interconnectivity to our infrastructure. And we're wondering if those studies have been done. We'd like to see them. We'd like to meet with the engineering planners that have considered these loads on our infrastructure. And if they haven't, then I would advise that something like that would be done.
Bill might be the good person to start with.
Bill Massaro, everyone.
So I attended the meeting with the consultant, with the committee's consultant at Water and Sewer. We presented the numbers to them. The consultant was tasked to come back with some usage numbers and some more details on where those numbers came from. I had pointed out that the numbers were significantly higher than the numbers that DCAM was proposing in their larger development, if you will. I do understand the reason for it. The reason, of course, was that most of the DCAM development was residential, and there's approximately a third of the scenario plan now, the current plan, that's commercial, which was projected to have a higher water use. But I could never get any details, and I think that the consultant was probably busy enough with some of the other issues regarding the use of the buildings and the rest of the plan that this kind of got pushed aside. The issue of the pump station requirement for the pump station semi fell through the cracks because the consultant was assuming that we could use the site of the old DCAM pump station that was torn down, decommissioned, but unfortunately that's not on land that the town purchased. So somewhere in the 12 acres or the 28 acres of the hospital parcel B, we'll have to find place for a pump station. I want to answer Bill's question about what additional studies have been done, who's looked at these things and everything else. The only studies that were done by PAR. PAR was at the meeting with the consultant that was held with the Board of Water and Sewer. PAR is under a contract with the consultant, and the consultant is out of money. So what you got is what you got. Now, I would suggest that perhaps we might ask to see some of the backup details. We have looked for supporting costs and everything else. Where did some of these infrastructure numbers come from? Where did the dollars, how are they derived and everything else? I don't know if we're going to get that data or not. I'm not sure what the quality of what exists is. My suggestion to Water and Sewer, when I made some of this information available to them, which is in the final version of the plan, unchanged right now, that you just got last week, was to get a sense of the reasonableness of the quantities and the impact on the capacity of the town to handle those things. In a discussion that I had with Mo and with Gene Minio to discuss possible alternatives for water and sewer infrastructure for the cultural center, I mentioned the current plan for the pump station and the infrastructure up the hospital, and Mo raised the issue of he wasn't sure whether there was sufficient capacity in the lines that ran from the old pump station to the treatment facility to handle the flow of the new water. Now, I mean, all I can suggest is somebody's got to look at it and raise the flag, but That's where we stand at the moment. I don't see much more information coming down at this stage of the master plan than what you've already got. And if you have issues, somebody better run a flag up real quick, send up a flare, and tell us that we've got a problem, and at least give us a bigger than a breadbasket kind of description of what our problem is. I was hoping that that's what would come out of this.
The other alternative that I keep hoping to have some information on is whether or not we can use the sewers on Long Meadow and Hospital to connect the hospital too, but we need information about the capacity of those, I think, before we can figure that out.
Well, I'll point out something that's when somewhere around page 180-something of the current master plan talks about possibility of options for early use of the Arboretum, and talks about how you could get a sewer hookup there. There are a couple of alternatives that were approached. One of them was essentially put in basically a stub infrastructure of a suitable capacity to handle what would ultimately happen at the rest of the property in the back. There was a comment made that the infrastructure could be connected at least from up Hospital Road, but there was no reading on whether what the capacity was. We have no information from the consultant on what the flow of the Arboretum would be, what the usage of water would be, what the usage of wastewater would be. It's all buried in the 120 to 150,000 gallons per day of drinking water and 100 and something of wastewater for the whole property. So we don't have any of that information.
Right.
Bill, the study that you're talking about, so I think the committee has looked at putting the infrastructure in on the site. That 150,000 gallons per day is the estimate of the water requirement for the
There's
site.
no water on the site.
Well, no. So my question to you is, when you talk about the studies that you're looking for, are you looking for a study that takes a look at the core infrastructure that the town has on Hospital Road? They're figuring out, once, we hook up to Hospital Road, or we have to extend to something from farther up Hospital Road. That's the piece that that's the cost piece, or even the technical piece you're looking for.
There's the technical piece, and there's also the supply. Like I said, it's not like electricity where we can just have another solar project come on. We have to look at
supply then.
Right.
And this is actually the presentation that Jeremy said in his email that was the presentation that Bill sent to you guys. So I'm talking about information that I got. I think Bill sent it to me earlier, but it came back in again. The tubular well field was billed as a well field that would come with the hospital that had a 500,000 gallon per day capacity. There was an engineering study that was done in 1989 and then completed in 1990 that appears to have validated that 500,000 gallons capacity, but I believe the tubular well field isn't usable in our current determination.
As part of the survey that we did in the last calendar year was to investigate all of the water sources in Medfield that would create a volume of a similar size. And that site is not something that was suitable.
Do you have any sense of how it is that the state represented it was a 500,000 gallon per day well field that was validated by engineers in 1990, that now it's dry, or because we need less than a third of it?
I can't speak to the engineering assessment from 30 years ago. I can't.
However, we have letters from the town saying the town agreed with those assessments. That's in the package. It's in the data package. I have the entire package, all of the stuff that happened regarding
something's not right here.
Right. Well, that's a good question. If you value the property because it had that resource in there and that resource isn't there, I don't know what your recourse is, or what the town's recourse would be for compensation for a resource that would be required. Basically underpinning the development of that project is the water that is in place.
So what was it when you did your evaluation of that well, what did it say? Did it say there was no water, or there was?
No, I don't recall that specific site, whether it would not be permitted because of its proximity to wetlands, or whether that was one of the sites that was tested, but we hit granite and couldn't get through it. There was a large,
right?
there was a large matrix. There was 15 different sites that we looked at. Yeah, it's a manual thing. Yeah,
I mean,
I've got a report thicker than the one that's on your desk, and it was not one that there is no water up there that we could find.
Could we get a better answer? No, not a better answer. Could we get a more
Answer
thorough,
other than me.
thorough answer?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
something's not right. 500,000 gallons a day goes away. That doesn't sound right.
Well, it doesn't sound fair. I think that's maybe.
Doesn't sound fair.
Yeah.
And, but something's odd when it's been confirmed as
Gus,
well.
particularly since that if you read all the supporting data from the town at the time that the DCAM was proposing the 440 unit development, the town basically said, don't worry, Tubular Wellfield can easily supply whatever we need, as a result of the hospital property.
I'd sure like to better understand how we're at zero.
Yeah, and part of this might have been regulatory through the years. I'd have to dig into the report myself that,
I mean,
those zones might be under the influence of surface water or for whatever reason they would just want to sustain that.
I don't try to force you to do it, if it's Mo or, I don't care who does it, but I'd sure like to understand that better.
It's more like just a phone call, because we had this report prepared. So the question is, if this was a candidate site for development, why did it not pass? What
So
were
you're
the
not
geological?
You're not sure if it even was a candidate site?
That's what I'm saying, that we have to, if this was considered, why did it not pass? Was it regulatory, geological, or, maybe it just didn't have any yield?
And if it wasn't considered, I'd like to know that too.
And-
In the most recent, because that's a little different than saying there's nothing there.
I believe there's yield tests results in some of the information that passed.
Well, something's not adding up, so.
But, the key issue is, do we have enough information, as sketchy as it might be, and without the supporting data behind it, to say whether the town has the ability to supply 150,000 gallons of water and get to the treatment facility 100 and something thousand gallons of wastewater a day. And if somebody can come up with a scientific wild guess as to yes or no, or at least make a fairly high-level assessment and say something's wrong here, we can or we cannot meet these numbers, there's no way we can do it, or say we need more information to figure out what it's going to cost to make us do that, I think those are the two pieces of information we need to have. Can we do it now? If not, what's it going to take to be able to do it?
And there's a third piece of information too, which is, will DEP permit us to take that additional water out of the ground? Because I think that's always an upper limit of what we can do and can't do too.
Except if the state sat there and sold us 500,000 gallon per day well that's got nothing in it. then I think we have to-
they didn't sell it to us. They gave it to it for $1.
But I'm saying they represented that this is the water supply for the hospital.
But it isn't something that they created out of whole cloth. I mean, there are reports. I mean, and
It was a well field, because it's a tubular well field.
well, I mean, of
Somebody
course,
was pulling water out.
well, you're right about the 15 sites. They probably had 15 wells or something along those lines there, because that's the whole idea of a tubular well field is a whole.
No, the 15 sites is a study that the Water and Sewage Board paid for in the last year to go around to
Okay.
all of the
But
candidate
basically,
sites.
the tubular well field is a bunch of little wells that don't go down very far, is my understanding of this. And one of the things that we talked about at the time of the 440 units, and Mr. Harney and I were some of the people who raised the question about where was the cost for turning the tubular well field into a modern well field, and why wasn't that included in the numbers and everything else, all of which subsequently went away with the hospital.
And some of those characterizations of types of wells, they have different types of permits than they did 30 years ago for withdrawals in different types of treatment. So a tubular well field that is, 20 feet below ground, that I can tell you has significantly different, permitting and treatment than, clear well water that has, artesian
I want to
pressure
point
underneath.
out that this issue complicates the MEPA process. there is a certificate from MEPA that approved the DCAM levels of water, actually based on the use of the hospital well field as a backup or an emergency. So the numbers that DCAM had proposed, which were about, I want to say it could be as much as 40% less than the actual water usage and everything else. DCAM made a commitment to reduce it even further. That was one of the conditions of the MEPA certificate. So the new project, if it does in fact require significant more amounts of water, and if there's any concerns about the town being able to supply that water, you're going to have a problem with this submission of the environmental impact report.
So Bill, is there's some information in the master plan about what the committee thinks the water is?
Love to read it, yeah.
So
Haven't seen it.
First, so you can get that. You might not want to read all of it, but at least you can get to the water part. Is there any other information that you would like from the, they may not have it. Is there any other information?
It's
you'd like
actually,
from the master committee?
this is more like a statement of, the board would like some engagement in the process that has been going on for some time. And, I mean, the process is going in its own path. Unless we raise our hand, we feel like the trajectory of demand of what's being planned up there has to be considered with the enterprise fund spend for projects that are already planned or in the process of being engineered. And if we have to think about an extra 15% demand in a specific part of our infrastructure, as well as finding that water and then transporting that wastewater, you know, by hook or by crook to get it there, that cost of just that analysis and that engineering has to be borne out and be borne by somebody. The enterprise funds are not set up at this time to conduct a study on the behalf of a possible developer. So I think the burden falls somewhere between the town and the developer's budget to figure that out, and then work with us to see how that aligns to the ability of our infrastructure to serve that.
Right. I mean, and it's typical with, I mean, most developments in town, even those that don't have the kind of profile or involvement in the town as this, that there is a water and sewer review and analysis and assessment. I mean, when we do the 40B projects and the rest of it, right, there's a review and the developer typically pays for that, right?
I've seen a couple, but I don't see it as a normal practice.
Okay. I mean, typically that's part of the, I mean, there's always, that's one of the criteria that's evaluated.
Well,
in the
what usually
process.
happens is that we're given a drawing to sign, and then we've got to do the analysis at a board meeting. So we're actually not an active part of that process. There's only one project that I remember in the last year where we expressed some, you know, some genuine concerns that actually turned the project differently than it was. So by and large, smaller projects, you know, we love serving, we love customers. We love selling water to customers and providing the service to the town. But when you're talking about such a step function change, you have to think about your infrastructure changing proportionally that way.
Right.
You know, a 40B project with 20 people or 30 people here, that becomes absorbed in some way. And even then, some of that is already cannibalizing, you know, a house that is small becomes a 40B project. You're sort of cannibalizing. So instead of adding 20 people, you're actually adding only 14 people net.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes sort of, you know, absorbable. And also that type of density as well. 40B projects tend to be higher density, also a little bit more modern in their approach to landscaping, lower maintenance, and the like. The hospital project, I don't know.
Right. So my question is more one of timing, right? In other words, is this something that we have to study and resolve before we do any zoning on it, or does this become part of the RFP that we expect the developer to do this analysis for us and provide a report reflecting how it would work and the rest of it? That's sort of the first question. And the second question I have is, and I'm not going to correctly describe this, but as I recall, the last time you were in April to talk about the two projects that were on the warrant for this year's annual town meeting.
Yes.
One of those projects I thought the part of the goal was to increase the capacity of that particular well. Is that right?
That is one of the there are two projects. One is Mount Nebo rehabilitation and painting. The second is the initial preliminary design to treat an existing well and possibly expand its capacity. We still have to go through that process. We already have indicative information that is going to be a very expensive project if we need to do all of what we think may be possible, as well as adding on, additional capacity for the future. So, and one, in that last selectmen meeting, we.
With that issue,
Yep.
to the extent that additional capacity is necessary for development at the hospital, I would think fairly a portion of that expense would be part of our base in the hospital development and the cost the town's expended for development of the
That
hospital.
has been an idle suggestion, in our meetings, that if there is such a large increment to the demands of the town's infrastructure, that this would be sort of part of the bill and be part of, obviously, the return on investment calculations for that developer. But I don't want to get too far into the weeds of all that. It's just that providing these two utilities, water and wastewater treatment, have not been connected to the hospital development project, and as is changed in its composition and types of use, hopes, dreams, in Medfield, providing these services hasn't really been connected to that.
Well, but so at this point, we're a month away from finalizing the master plan. So if you're, I'm trying to picture what does engagement look like as a practical matter between now and the end of the end of the month?
Well, I think Selectman Marcucci, that it was a question, maybe within a question, like, who decides what are the next steps? Does it have to be done now?
Well, from a detailed design standpoint, this is a master plan. This is like broad-based. This is top, not top down, but it's broad question. So if I were to try, and again, I'm not qualified, but if I were to try to envision what you all would be contributing to this, at the most fundamental level, you'd be calling out, blowing the whistle one way or the other on whether or not the water department can come up with 150,000 gallons per day to supply the hospital. Either you can or you can't, either because it goes from one of the vaults you have, or there's this open question around the tubular well field. And then there's a second question, which is, even if you can do that, does the fundamental core infrastructure of the town off the site, I'm guessing the water is probably straightforward because there's a tower there, but maybe I'm wrong. But between both the water, do you have the capacity to deliver water to the site? More importantly, probably, or perhaps, do you have the capacity to handle the waste that will be coming off that site, both in terms of getting it where it needs to go in terms of pump stations and things like that, but also in terms of just the capacity of the sewage treatment plant? So if we have town level infrastructure
Those are all
problems-
my questions.
Well, but
You've
those
summed
would
them up.
So at the level that we've got things right now, before this plan goes final, it would be good is there a way to get a comparable, back of the envelope estimate on whether that is or isn't a problem? Not exact numbers, but do we or don't we have a problem there?
I
do that?
I don't know how to coach you through that, other than when you look at a 30,000-foot view of any master plan, there are always going to be errors and omissions that happen as part of that, as part of those studies. The impact on the towns with this specific resource is something that can only be solved here in Medfield. Like I said, if they're off by 20% on electricity, there's another way of dealing with that. Right? But with water, it has to come from what we have, what we're permitted to use, and also what we're permitted to use on that specific time. To say it another way, if we had this sort of demand, we had 150,000 as an average demand, but it turns into a peak demand of 220,000 1,000 gallons because it's this time of year, that is going to be a challenging situation, because we can look at 1,000-foot levels and annual averages, but when the rubber meets the road, is the water there and the wastewater services there at the peaks when people need them? That's when and that is the question. So it is that cyclicality of use during the seasons based on the demographics of not just the people, but the split between residents and the density of those developments and the commercial mix to know, is it all happening when everyone else wants the water, or is it going to be levelized because of its design, and it's creating that sort of, harmony of demand?
Let me ask my question a different way. Between now and the time that the master plan is finalized, is there anything useful that the Water and Sewerage Board, working with the Master Planning Committee, could do that would get us to any insights at the level of broad estimating that we're at right now? Or are those issues you're raising really ones we need to remember when we move down into the more next stage of detailed planning?
I can't speak for the entire board, which is just Christian over there, but I think this is right. But I mean, ultimately, this is going to require a professional services survey and analysis.
That's a downstream
Yeah,
thing.
I think that someone is going to have to put pen to paper, fingers to keyboard, and they're going to have to, go out into the field and do some work on this. We don't have a status of our infrastructure, at a given time to be able to predict and model that sort of demand at those nodes of wherever these tie-ins are expected to be.
Steve, you need a microphone. Can we just get a microphone for Mr. Nolan? Thank you.
That we weren't blind to this issue. We have a section in here on utilities, starts on page 110. The consultant met with water and sewer, tried to give them an order of magnitude of what we were talking about demand, and there's a discussion in here about, this is all very order of magnitude, preliminary numbers. In fact, we had a part of that article that was turned down at town meeting was an engineering article to put forward further infrastructure design, because we don't have a design. We're at zero. We're not even sure what's going to be up there. So I think from our consultant's perspective, we did what we could do given the order of magnitude of what we're looking at. She did make recommendations about water conserving measures up there and some things that should be included in an RFP to make sure the water demand is reduced to the extent possible, being cognizant of the fact that we have limitations on our water supply. I don't think there's anything else we can do at this point. We'll get one of the deliverables is to get a lot of the backup that the consultants did in their analysis of looking at the layout of the infrastructure and proposals of how to deal with the pump station, how to get the sewage to the sewage treatment plant. So we'll make sure that we get those and share them with water and sewer. But a lot of this is going to be more detailed design work going forward. So at this point, we don't have any budget for one thing, but I think we did try to address this in the plan, so it's not like we were not cognizant of it, but there's only so much you could do at this level.
All right, but I think the broader question, if it is a master plan, what are the boundaries of that plan? If it is just a development of the hospital, then that's one thing, but if it is assumed that those costs and for the infrastructure and those demands are also to connect to our infrastructure, we would like to understand if those studies have been done. It's almost rhetorical that it hasn't been done, but it is a type and size that the work is going to have to get done. At some point, it becomes either something of a, you put the burden on the developer to do that work, or someone has to put that investment in to de-risk the project. Mm-hmm. So if you can somebody can present that, then it de-risks the project immediately from a water and wastewater resources. And de-risking takes usually two things, time and money. And I don't know where the two of those are in this project. We don't have the money budgeted in the enterprise fund to develop future customers for something that we don't know anything about. So we would suggest that those funds come from some other source. But as a citizen, I could say that I would hope that if it is a master plan, that it becomes a master plan of more integrated into the town as opposed to just a valuable asset to be developed.
Great, thank you. So I think we've probably gotten as far as we can on the water and sewer Medfield State Hospital issue as tonight.
Okay.
I think I certainly hear loud and clear where you're coming from on this. And I think it's up to us to make sure that this is properly considered as part of the overall process. I think as we come to the end of, and that's it for your water issues.
Okay.
Unless you have another one.
No, I'm good.
Okay, all right.
See me twice a year. That's
right.
Right.
So I think unless, okay, Teresa. Microphone.
Just to follow up on Steve's point regarding the master plan, in the financial chapter, there is a chart, and yes, these are very high-level numbers, but that outlined water and sewer, pipe links, cost, and so forth. It's a small chart to take a look at.
Thank you. So I think unless, Peter, Gus, unless you have anything else with respect to the hospital, I think obviously this will be a subject of discussion next week and at all of our meetings until it's resolved. So we obviously have some decisions to make with respect to what we're going to vote on at town meeting and what we're going to do before town meeting. And obviously, Steve, any input from your committee that you have on that, we'll continue to have those discussions. But thank you again for being here, and we'll see you next time this comes up.
Thanks to all of you for your efforts on this.
Okay, back to the things you really came here for. The vote to sign the building official certification form. John, you want 30 seconds? You can have 30 seconds. I mean, what would you like to address at this point? I'm sure I will, John, and I've heard it before. Well, I apologize for being ignoble. It was 2 hours ago, and we have to cover some of this stuff. You know what, John? You're correct. I offered you time. You'll get time. John Harney. You're right. Go. Well, they can tune in.
Well, I will take the advantage of it. Thank you for correcting yourself.
I excel at that. You make as many errors as I do, you have to be good at it.
You know, there are certain, but very few, facts that revolve around the hospital. And one is that the people of Medfield have historically spoken time and again for open space, for protection of the land. And that was true when we bought the Holmquist 100 acres. It was true when we bought the Cronin land far more recently. And it's been true with one, possibly two exceptions in my 53 years in town. I don't think you're properly valuing that property. I hear nothing about how present value of the land, except we see in McCabe Consultants that it's $8.5 million for the upper part.
Can I interrupt you just briefly, John?
Yep.
Do you think we should not put this to a vote of the people of the town?
I think that the hard work of this committee and the money expended by the town to get a report warrants the town hearing the report. The report is, in my view, a concept rather than a plan. You used the word flexible at one point. Other people have used other words, but the long and the short of it is, there isn't a concrete plan here. And if you read McCabe's long report here, which is still in some process of being finalized, what you see are a lot of caveats about the various funding sources. But the one sure thing is the town is a victim of major exposure on this. It has been said that we should have taken the 440. And I, who oppose that vehemently, believe that that may have been the better case to do. The state would still own the land, not own the land, but would be in charge of a larger area around there. would have far more input than it's going to have here if the town goes ahead and does approve this, which I think is a very long shot for you. I don't think you will get your zoning, although if you go for it, we'll see. If the zoning doesn't get changed, there's no plan anyway. So we start over, and we look at what's in Medfield's real interest here. And that is to keep that land for Medfield's use. I get, Mr. Murby is invincibly starting his rant about the short money that it is taking to keep the grass cut and so forth. It's ridiculous. I mean,
Let me interrupt you again, John, because one of the reasons why I was hesitant to get into this is that what we have to figure out now is, are we going to have a town meeting, and what are we going to put before the town? And so if you're thinking we should just not have a town meeting and just say we're going to leave it as is, fine. But otherwise, these are arguments directed towards the substance of whether we should accept this plan or not. And I think for the Board of Selectmen now, we have to be focused on, and I don't disagree with everything you're saying either. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I don't disagree with everything you're saying. Okay, I think there's a lot of wisdom in some of it. Okay, but that goes to the substance of the plan, and we are not yet at the point where we can make a judgment on the substance of the plan because the plan is not done.
The plan is not
We've
done.
not figured out what the next step
And
is
major
going to be.
issues like the condition of the properties of the several buildings, 34 or so, whatever number are still there, of the buildings are now hazardous for the town, because if they fall, there'll be double, triple the cost to get rid of the debris. That should have been settled a long time ago and those buildings taken down. We should have settled with Mass Historic a long time ago. There's no reason that we can't have sound figures for what demolition of the buildings that need to come down is really going to be at. And so some of these things just have been put on a siding, and we've gone on and made believe that we're going to develop that thing into some idyllic spot, and we're not. I mean, every developer who's come in there, and every consultant who's come in there said density, 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 more and more housing. No one's talked commercial, and the state never talked commercial up there.
Because it's 20 minutes from the highway. So
Pardon?
It's 20 minutes from the highway and there's no
Exactly,
trains there. So-
exactly.
Right.
Take
So,
down.
yeah. And
take-
again,
You know,
my question to you is, are you saying that you think the Board of Selectmen should just decide we're not going to develop the hospital, let it go, and not put it to a town meeting? 'Cause
I'm saying the
unless
Board of
that-
Selectmen has an absolute responsibility to say that that hospital property is put to use. And it can be put to very positive use. It can make money for the town. And not all of the buildings were ever going to be scheduled to come down. So that, I mean, we set up a straw man, and we pursued a course of action because the selectmen of previous boards supposedly gave instructions along those lines in the charge to the committee. We got off from a wrong principle, and we're reaching a wrong conclusion. And we should start over.
Thank
And
you.
Could I just ask one question, John? When you say put the property to use, what use would you put it to?
I would develop some relatively modest number of affordables up there in a section of it that would warrant or would suffer that.
What would that number be? Do I have approximate?
50 or so.
And that would be it?
I mean, we've already heard time and again that we're going to have the housing shortage, the 40B shortage,
Sure.
filled before we put a spade in the ground up there. And
But that would be
probably
it?
will.
That would be, I've just never been able to quite follow what you had in mind. Is that it?
Of course not. If you have Park and Rec crying for fields, you have the schools wearing out their fields, you can have a lot of
Turn the rest of the fields.
put fields up there. I think you can have walking paths. You can have something that would be an area where people could enjoy the outdoors, picnics and so forth, townspeople. You could do many things up there, educational programs up there, and you're banking the property in case it's really in need for the future, and
But you
open
take-
land in western.
The buildings would come down, though.
I'm talking about the land. I'm not talking about the buildings should come down. This idea that they're historic wonders is ludicrous, okay? And whether or not you can have the cultural council's project there go ahead, I think you'd find support from town for that, as long as there's money from foundations and so forth. But you won't find it at the taxpayers. The taxpayers in this town want a town that they moved into. They want sound, high-quality education. They don't mind paying for that, and they don't mind charging us old people with that, and I don't mind, frankly, paying for it. I think it's a good thing to have great schools. My kids went through here and did well, and I don't think most people, some people are hurting in town, there's no question about it. But, you know, other people paid for my kids, so that,
We'll find out, John.
We're gonna.
Find out what the people of Medfield want. So.
Pardon?
We'll find out what the people of Medfield want.
You have in the past, and you will again, and you will be, I can see going for putting a zoning article on. I will oppose it. We'll see if it passes. If it passes, then it opens the door for this. If it fails, but the town should bring some, I hate the word closure because it's so often used, but should bring some definition and finality to whether that land's going to be developed to become a huge, huge exposure financially and educationally for the town.
But don't you think that the town meeting would benefit from having a choice between the best possible development option and the alternatives versus stopping now and putting, I don't know what, before it?
This is not the best possible option. I mean, this option is a result of torturous years here, running through consultants, you know, expensive consultants, VHB and then McCabe, bringing in a mediator, people dropping off of the committee, new people coming on to the committee, right? It hasn't been an easy process, and the end result is flawed beyond understanding.
Thank you. Mr. Judge.
Thanks, John.
Surprise!
Dick Judge, 8 Juniper. I'm an odd person living in an even house, as we discussed earlier.
The question is, did you water your lawn today?
That's right. I have to call home and shut off the sprinkler. The water conservation, I'm completely on board with. I mean, we have you know, people kill each other over water out west. So let's not make light of that. And I'm sure we're going to address that fully in the once we get some zoning issued up there and try to see what. Basically, the market is going to decide what we do up there. And it's also going to decide whether we do anything up there. So what we need to do is get some good open zoning, present it to developers and say, show us something beautiful that you can do. And the reason they're going to come is because we can set the table in who doesn't want to move to Medfield? I mean, what a beautiful town. High class, first class education. I mean, this is private school education that we give our kids in Medfield. People pay tons of money in taxes, and then they pay tons of money more to send their kids to private school. Medfield provides that now. So when you talk to a developer about developing a property in a town that everyone wants to live in and everyone wants to bring their kids to and everybody wants to live in as an older person, this is the town. So do not sell ourselves short on the value of this property, whether it's developed in a great way or left to be on its own. But in order to set the table to decide what we want to do with the property as a town, we need to bring it to the town and say, look, we need to open up the zoning there and see what the developers come up with, because we can discuss that we want this many older folks to live there and this many kids to live there, but you know what? We don't get to decide. The developers will tell us what is profitable for them and what they can have on this piece of property. So I just wanted to be brief in saying that This is unbelievable. We have so many smart people in this town. All these people volunteering, you guys are volunteering.
We get paid.
Yeah. I hope you get a stipend for medical and dental too, but I don't think so. So the idea that we're coming together as a town, we have an unbelievable jewel in the crown with this property for this town, and that we were smart enough to acquire it from the state, whom we had no idea what would do with it, but we all knew that it wouldn't be good for the town. So now we can, we're in a unique spot to create our own direction with this. And I want to, I showed up here tonight to make sure the can was kicked down the road to keep this thing rocking and rolling, because if the developer sees that the town is wishy-washy about what direction, or if they even want to take RFPs or RFIs, then they're going to sit back and they're going to say, well, I don't want to get involved with that town because they just drag their feet on everything. We need to set the table correctly so the developer that comes in here not only puts together an RFI or an RFP that will everyone in town will go, wow, I never even thought of that. That's great. That's great. Let's leave it open and get this thing done. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. All right, building official certification for Chris Canny, our new building commissioner.
Correct.
What is that?
Every time you appoint a new building commissioner, you must notify the state that you have a new certified building commissioner in place.
Okay.
And they require the chairman of the Board of Selectmen as the appointing authority to sign the paperwork, and I will have it notarized as well.
Do we need a motion to do that?
You've already appointed him.
Okay.
You appointed him, he started June 11th, so this is just the follow-up paperwork.
So we need a motion to sign.
I move that we sign the building official certification form for Chris Canny, building commissioner.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Licenses and permits, consent agenda. Any objections to the items on the consent agenda?
Nope.
We have a motion.
I move that we approve both items on the consent agenda as written in our agenda.
Second?
Vote.
All in favor?
Aye.
Second.
All right, we're gonna spin back now that Mike Sullivan has returned. And thankfully, Mike was not here for the discussion with the Water and Sewer Board, because I don't think I could have handled all the water puns that would have been emanating from that seat during Bill's appearance. I don't know if I could have handled it tonight.
You never brought up about throwing anybody in the deep end.
No, it would have made a real
Waiting
splash,
for that one.
right? Yeah.
It would have been a real waste.
All right, Hinckley property.
Just a question on the consent agenda. There was a permit that came up before for road race, and that was going to serve alcohol at it, and you turned it down because you said there would be children present.
No, because it was 9 AM on a Saturday morning. They were finishing by 10.
Okay,
It was
that's fine.
before noon.
That's it.
This is that beer garden, I think, in
Yeah.
the.
Gus
they
confirmed
have,
it was
you know.
PM to
Yeah, I
PM.
did, I just double checked.
Okay,
No,
so
it had more to do with having a
nighttime,
bunch of
night's
kids run
okay,
a
yeah.
5K race, and then at 10 in the morning, watch all the adults start banging beers down at the same time.
Never drink wine before 10 a.m.
Not after a road race.
So, Mike, we had talked, when you were down with the Water and Sewer Board, we had talked about this request for the Hinckley approval, and I think Gus and I both had a question about this parcel, because I think our understanding was there was the potential for a buildable single lot
Sure.
carved out of this, and I thought that's what we were gonna get out of this particular subdivision. We'd get the Hinckley property for the proposed senior housing, and then we'd get the buildable single-family lot out of it. Oh, we got a bigger picture here.
When we bought this land, the Hinckley family wanted to keep the parcel with the old post office on it, that old, the original post office there. That would have left us with only a 20-foot strip of land to, if we wanted to develop the Hinckley parcel at some point in the future. So we negotiated with them for an additional 20-foot right-of-way, which gives us 40 feet access into the property.
Yep.
So while it doesn't have frontage on Harding Street, it does have 40 feet access from Harding Street.
My understanding is that when there was a survey done, there are wetlands between the front part of that lot and the back part of the lot, which would make putting a road in fairly difficult because you'd have a wetland crossing. And that's why I think that was separated off as a potential, if you wanted to get some money back on this, selling it as a single-family house lot. Now, Pete has mentioned at a couple of meetings whether we should look at trying to combine this with the Sweeney House, which for most people, it's that white house that up on Harding Street where the turkeys sit in the trees. So, that could be combined with it. I believe it abuts it there.
I thought it was with the Olson property, wasn't that with the?
That was another one, I think.
Or was that a separate discussion?
Sweeney is the immediate abutter to the
well,
right of way.
That's the
And-
It's here.
It's not the one on the corner, it's
It's this one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that also ties in with the Olson property, which they are not interested in selling right now, but they indicated at some point they might.
What's the size
B.
of parcel B?
4.8 acres. It says 4.8 acres uplands, 2.62 acres not a buildable lot, 9.69.
You could run a road in and do at least a few house lots of a traditional subdivision, or more if you were gonna do something.
So
40B or
so
whatever.
Mike, the question was really, I mean, when this first came up originally, the entire Hinckley property was gonna be rezoned, the 40R, that was suitable for what we need on the parcel A. I pushed to not do that because I was aware there was a buildable lot, or at least I thought I was aware, that had that access. I balked at this when it first came up because what we're saying here is neither one is a buildable lot, and I'm saying, wait a minute, I thought the access, that 40 feet of access of, not frontage, I guess, but the access to Harding Street provides the opportunity for a driveway to go in, and then Mark was saying, well, maybe at one point that was the case, but maybe that's not the case now. And I basically deferred and said, I think you know the history on this better than.
You could, I think rather than driveway, under the subdivision rules and regulations, you'd have to build a street according to the subdivision rules and standards. I imagine if it was limited use for, say, one lot, you might be able to get some waiver. You couldn't get a complete waiver from the board because that would open up the whole thread of pork chop lots.
So my only interest
But I think
was
you
to
could
not
get
have
some.
at least one buildable lot that the town owns, basically zoned in a way that makes it an unusable lot where we lose $250,000, $500,000 in an asset because of what we're doing. So that was the whole interest that I had in this. I didn't even care about building on it yet.
Teresa, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Mike mentioned that survey that was done on the Hinckley property in Lot 3, and that was part of that wetland survey.
Yeah.
But it's my understanding that out of that survey, it also mentioned the heavy amount of ledge that's in that area where you're talking about trying to build a single-family home. Just wanted to make you aware that it's also heavy ledge up there.
Right, so the
But if
point of
it's-
adding, that's just, it's a title issue. If you're not actually showing zoning compliant lots at the time you record a plan, then the practice is to have those parcels designated as not buildable lots. It doesn't mean anything.
Right. I did confirm that with Sarah as well while we were having a meeting, that she did not think there would be an issue to put a roadway and or a driveway to the lot that we're trying to subdivide. The other one is not buildable until you extend Ice House Road to make it part of that. So she did not think, and said typically, most of her A&R plans say non-buildable lots until they come into effect.
This would have to be extended to come within the proposed senior housing.
Correct.
overlay
Yep.
district, right?
That would make it a buildable lot.
So what I hear you all telling me is by approving this thing, we are not taking a piece of property that the town owns that has potential value. We're not doing something here that will make sure it has no value, but in fact, it still retains its value, its
No,
potential value should we choose to.
And the real value might be unlocked at a future date if you acquired some
yeah.
adjacent parcels that would allow, as Pete thought, to
I'm fine with
do
that.
some
I just didn't
additional
want it to
development,
get
yeah.
I didn't want the value destroyed
Yeah.
because we administratively did something that,
Well,
It's-
there's nothing on the
yeah.
interior lot that's being created that adds any value from a developable basis to this, the lot that's close to the Harding Street, because it's not adding anything to that access issue.
Although, and as far as the ledge goes on that lot, I just look at the house where they did tear the old post office down to put a house up, and that was built on one hunk of ledge. It was unbelievable, so, on the ledge, yes.
On the ledge, but you drill in to build with some things.
They actually elevated that house about 10 feet above the ledge.
The only relevance of ledge really is if you needed a septic system, because otherwise, there's all kinds of ways to build on, over, or through ledge.
and for what it's worth, the people who own the property that's got the easement on it, they're right on the corner there, and I'm not particularly trying to destroy the right-hand side of their property, because it would be an awkward thing to take that full front, take that full width, because it's.
The 20
half of
feet,
the
yeah.
lawn. So I just wanted to make sure we didn't preclude, obviously, if one of the other piece of property became available and you could do something that made more
Yeah.
sense, that would be far preferable. I'm not going after their side of the property, it's just that I didn't want to
Yeah.
see it locked up in a way that we suddenly say,
Although they would have known that at the time they acquired it, because when they acquired it, the easement was already on the lot, so.
yeah, no, yeah. Well, and all the same, if we don't have to make somebody
Yeah.
suffer damage, even if it's legally allowable. I'm not trying to do that, but.
Yeah.
So we had action on it. Right? To approve it.
Motion to sign, I believe, is we need.
All right, so it was, okay, I move that we sign the application for endorsement of plan believed not to require approval for the Hinckley property subdividing the property into, or not, reboundarizing the property into two parcels, parcel A and B.
And again, I'll recuse myself.
That's right. I will
Yep.
second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, all right, so 2-0, it passes. Town administrator update.
Yeah, I don't know if you've been down to 109, but they finished the paving on 109 from,
Record time.
oh, yes, it was amazing, yeah. And it would have been faster, except the machine broke down the day they did it, and that delayed it a couple of days. But they will be doing the paving, the striping, both on North Street and 109, so.
I
But
was
it,
impressed by how fast it was. That's right outside my house, and it was.
oh, that's right, yeah, you could look out the
That's what I
window
could
and
see.
see it, yeah, yeah.
But it seemed like it got done, because we had to go back around to get there. It was done, and before you knew it, it
Yeah,
was less than a day.
when you compare it to some of our abutting neighbors
Yeah.
that have been construction going on for
Yeah.
years, it's remarkable, so. The highway does a terrific job, I think, so.
All right, anything else?
I have nothing else.
Selectmen reports. Pete.
At my office hours last Friday, I had someone from Green Street come in to see me, and they were concerned about the fact that Park and Rec won't let them park in the parking lot that's connected to the Hinckley Pond anymore. And I explained to them that the selectmen have no control over what Park and Rec do, but I suggested that I would send Park and Rec a letter, an email, and just suggest to them my thoughts on it.
Yes.
That's not new, depending who it was.
Yes, they've been to Park and Rec several times, and they've been
Yeah, she
calling.
told me that she
so,
had been to
yeah,
Park and Rec,
yeah.
and she was
Um,
disturbed that apparently Park and Rec lets people park at Metacomet, but not at Hinckley. And then I got an update on Council on Aging operation as well, so that's it.
I spent about 2.5 hours over the weekend with Jean Minio, she's not here unfortunately now, and Jerry Potts, Bob Tormey, to better understand the Arts and Culture Center plan. I had gone through that in similar depth to this master plan, which is even longer. But we had a good discussion. If either of you do take the time to, or have taken the time, I was a little concerned about the third and fourth phase. I was actually concerned about all the phasing, second, third, and fourth, but third and fourth phases go out beyond pure music and arts into some technology things, makerspace things. And I had a few concerns. One was whether they were overlapping or competing with other parts of what's going on in town. Turns out they're not. One of the interesting things that came out of that discussion, though, is if the Arts and Culture Center does turn out to be an anchor that adds value to the residents, the residents, you know, the housing that's going in up at the state hospital, the third and fourth phases that get more into technology and into fabrication and into things like that have the potential to add value to the commercial side that we might do up there. And they weren't really pitching all of that stuff. It's kind of like, well, this is the vision of where this could go if these first phases work out. So we talked a little bit about they've got it all in the plan, but it's not really like a master plan where they're about to take over the world, I guess is what I'm saying.
I don't think I have anything, so that's it. Any last words? Might
No.
be back next week. I hope that our agenda is not too filled up. We can focus on our items for next week.
I've booked no appointments, and we are just focusing on housekeeping issues for the Board of Selectmen, financial policies, appointments,
Goals.
goals.
But we should put Medfield State Hospital back on there as well.
We'll put that back.
Do we have the replacement for Mike on the agenda for the next week?
For next week.
Next week, okay.
Yep.
And Christine, we can just, the revised version of this letter, I have to get that signed for Jean.
Okay.
When does she need it by?
The first one is next week, no.
Okay. So if we revise it.
We'll revise it and we'll,
sign it. So,
yep.
all right, we're adjourned.
Good, great. I didn't move. I moved we
What I
adjourn the
can do
meeting.
is, since,
All in favor?
Aye.
since she authorized you to sign it, has to be in a PDF anyway, what I'll do is I'll just send it to you, you can sign it and send it back to her. I think that's probably the easiest, if you're happy to come here.
Medfield TV, community shows.